we have a few technical issues. My talk is about harnessing African media's viability, trying to focus on the opportunities and challenges. It is a very long kind of focus, but what I want to do is to highlight a few evidence from my presentation. We have all been talking about how we are sort of, being dragged, kicking and screaming into this fourth industrial revolution. Now, what does it mean? This revolution is, the age of the tech giants, and a lot of people argue that this has ramifications for all of us, including, Africans who have so far been on the margins of the information superhighway. One of my colleagues, Francis Nyamjo, is the investor director. He argues that if there's an information superhighway, the Africans are walking on the margins. The number of internet users in Africa is very minuscule, it's very small. As of 2017, we are talking of Africans constituting 10.9% of the world's internet users. And internet penetration on the continent, although we talk about it as if it's pervasive, is still very minuscule. We're talking of levels of 35%. But even within this, it doesn't tell the whole story because it's a lot of problems with access. It's a lot of problems with cost. It's a lot of problems with the and other infrastructural limitations. But also I wanted to highlight the point that these concerns about the giant techs coming to Africa and also the interest that we have about giant techs coming into Africa. It is only appropriate that we situate the discussion in the, when we look at these giant techs which are coming especially from the Western sphere, it raises a number of historical and ideological questions. And if the giant techs are seen by politicians, by media and businesses as the answer, what is the question? What are we responding to? What is the issue? And we should always be clear about what it is. Otherwise, when you look at history, there have been concerns, especially from the global south, about how some of these flows, if they are embraced in an unthought of way, it can result in asymmetrical communication that is fundamental implications for the cultural and economic sphere. The McBride Commission report from 1980 is a classic example where members of the Global South came together to try and address some of the concerns. So we need to connect to that. I also wanted to highlight that yes, the media were American, according to Jeremy Turnstile, a very leading writer in media. He wrote another book called The Media Were American. So he represents this shift. But however, we need maybe not to celebrate that the media are beyond the American model. I think the presentation from my colleague, the keynote yesterday, she highlighted how these are very powerful kind of conglomerates, which are worth trillions of dollars, which are much more powerful. So the issues of asymmetrical relations are very important. One of my esteemed colleagues at the University of Westminster is very clear about how we should be alert to some of the structural imbalances that we have in the communication sphere. His name is Christian Fuchs. He has, for example, reformulated the imperialism thesis and used it to analyze how there's a concentration of big capital and that they are now, for example, capitalist monopolies, whose behavior sometimes is not necessarily in the interest of the world's poorest. They get richer and richer, and some of their unethical behaviors have implications for the politics as we had. Including in Africa, I think the Nigerian election, we all hear that perhaps came. So yes, there are concerns. one of the books that I quite like is also called The End of Power by Moses Naine. He argues that there is a change in the, yes, these American corporations, tech giants may be powerful, but there is a way in which there are other forces that are chipping away at that power. So the counter power, the micro powers that are emerging from the global south, from China, we had also yesterday at the conference. And from Africa here, we have also our own counter forces, contra flows that are emerging. But again, the original, those are quite interesting. But what I also want to highlight is that in African context, we need to be aware of how this new dispensation is especially in line with also the broader neoliberal framework. Yes, we have had party state-controlled media models that have not delivered. These have been associated with patronage, with controls, with favors, and now with what we call state capture. In many parts of the continent, we are so much into this idea. And the market-based media models, they are not all negative, they are also representative. A new focus on customers, a new focus on mass sales, a new focus on their advertising friendly and things like that. And we heard from my colleague yesterday talking about the need to develop trust, the need to develop loyalties. These are things that were never there in the state party-controlled media models that are common in Africa. So what I'm saying is that yes, when we are thinking of applying the lens of decoloniality to the tech giants, we should be aware of other perspectives, but we should also not lose focus on the historical arguments. So if, for example, we bring in the idea of, yes, Africa should decolonize, how does that relate to media management? How do media managers decolonize? It's all like, they say this is politics, we are doing business. And how does it apply to training? How does it apply to research? Should African people who are interested in media management be trained in the same way as people say in New York? Are there differences that, are there values that should differentiate the training? Yesterday I got an article from my colleagues Morgan in China. In the article they argue about a need for a deliberate and conscious act of epistemological disobedience against prescribed methodologies and philosophies. I quite like that because they also emphasize the idea of avoiding mimicry and parrot. When you are in business, you have to use tried and tested formula. And if you don't reinvent the way we have templates that work here. But if you ignore the cultural elements, what else are you losing here? So I challenge media managers to also think about this need to be critical, to be self-critical, think about the values that underline the training formulas that they use, the templates that they use. Are they just embracing mimicry and parrot? Are they because if we want to be honest, media businesses are purposely created. They are a result of the interests of the owners. Like when you see Mark Zuckerberg defending his company, there are some special interests of the owners, the shareholders. And so what we have is as tech systems that are purposely created by actors that are infused with certain values. So they are, in a way, about power. They are about political. There are political interests that are involved. Like if you go into a boardroom, not everyone has the right to speak, isn't it? There is a hierarchy. There are ways in which those with power will display it. So we should look at the element of media businesses as something that is political, that is vested interest, but it's also a battleground for various values. And in Africa, when we are opening our arms to embrace the giant techs, nothing wrong with it, but we should do it in a way that is aware of these political and economic conflicts and differences that I'm talking about. For example, who defines a media management problem or a policy? It's always something political. Um, as Sandra Brahman argues, how a policy issue or how a media management issue is identified is political because this has implications for the kind of resources that are also directed at resolving the issue. So when we are thinking about tech giants in Africa and their insertion, their implications, and how they are coming, we should think about the competition, the resources, the influence, and the issues of power that inevitably come with that. It's not all handshakes and smiles, it's about something else. I'll get to the point. We heard also yesterday about the value chains. This is very important to bear in mind. These are businesses with linked kind of processes. And so when one activity takes place, when they come and invest in a particular area, it is part of an exchange. It is part of something linked to the production values, the rights, the forms of technologies that the company has chosen to use. And we should also think very carefully about the expansionist strategies. I will mention later on how some Africans are believing that we are at a stage of the second scramble for Africa, that these texts are actually constituting a concern that we should take seriously. But at the same time, they're also an opportunity. But how do we balance it? Like yesterday, presentation from a Chinese colleague, they said they believe in the theory of harmony, of balance. Yeah. So we should think carefully about how to strike balance, how to understand what we should, what is important to us. So when you look at the insertion of big companies, they don't have just one area where they are. So when they come to us, we should also understand the synergies that they bring, the vertical integration that they have, the horizontal integration that they have. I think to understand also the companies that are inserted into some of this, like Nesmas in South Africa, which is in business with Tencent. We should try to understand how do they work, how are they creating value within that relationship. We should also try to be critical. For example, the reporting of Mark Zuckerberg's visit to Nigeria. What were people focusing on? They saw opportunities, yes. But Mark Zuckerberg, for him, he argued that the future will be built in Africa. He said the entrepreneurial energy that you find in Africa is something that will make Africa the central point. He said the future of the world will be built in Africa. And for him, he saw a lot of opportunities in the continent, in the way he encountered people. But at the heart of it, we heard yesterday that it's a roller coaster kind of industry, this giant tech business. There's monetization and control. It's a hyper-competitive environment. Yes, it's becoming boundaryless, but part of the boundaryless is the search for audiences and the search for control, where it's about amassing as much power as possible. It's about buying your competitors. It's about getting the next opportunity before the other person does. So it's about inevitably diversifying interests. So they need us as much as we need them. But are we understanding what is at stake? One of my former colleagues, Nicholas Gardner, I don't know whether some of you know him, he argued that the media everywhere else, in Africa and in other parts of the world, they are always, after a limited pool of disposable income. They are after a pool of limited advertising revenue. They are also searching, they are also in search of consumption time, which is limited. And also the skills and technical labor that goes into the media, which is a major input, is limited. And this kind of analysis results in a certain kind of behavior, or in certain realization that they ought to behave in a certain way. there are certain consequences. For example, the way they are approaching or making their product viable, the way they're reducing risk within their business. So inevitably, for example, they have to produce prototypes. They have to make many hits. If one doesn't make it, the other one will do. I'm quite excited that, yes, in Africa, we may also have our own media tech giants coming up. In South Africa here, when SAPA collapsed, I don't know whether many of you are aware of this, the business formula was bought by African business people. They formed in 2015 an African news agency, which is multimedia, which is diversified. And now it's formed in 2015. Now it's worth $1 billion. It's a bit understated, but it's growing. I also want to highlight, and according to them, there's a lot of stories there, a lot of focus that we should pay attention to. Africa has so many untold stories. In music, we are also beginning to see African musicians collaborating. Zimbabweans, Nigerians, and all that. This is a response to the precarious nature of the media business. There's a tendency to diversify output to avoid risk. I also want to highlight, I saw Professor Robert Pickard here. He has a very important realization that we should pay attention to. This spiral of decline model is something that we should pay attention to. Media managers should understand this. He says, for example, that lack of profitability of a media firm can result in reduced expenditures on content and staff. Less desirable audiences can result in less advertising. Further reductions in financial resources can also result in reduced expenditures in media content. Less desirable audiences can result in less advertising. When you look at the SABC, is this not what is happening? Are they not aware of the spiral of decline? When you look at ZBC in Zimbabwe, when you look at ZNBC, when you look at the different media companies, most of them, they are in financial stress, and part of it is the lack of understanding of this spiral of decline, which is impacting on their profitability. They need to invest in staff. They need to. They don't need to reduce their expenditures on key areas that are core to the business. The awareness of risk avoidance strategies is something that is not very common in Africa, but it's very, very necessary. What do we do to avoid risk strategies? The talk about leapfrogging that is quite common in Africa is something that fascinates me. Yes, there is adoption of new technologies at the cutting edge, and this is resulting in novel solutions. M-Pesa in Kenya is something that has resulted in a solution for the unbanked Africans. Ushahidi, geotagging, which has now gone global. The Americans were using it to resolve the aftermath of the storm, where they were trying to take account of the problems in the area. EcoCash, for example, in Zimbabwe, has also gone into finding a solution for the unbanked, who are in a majority in Africa. So leapfrogging is very good, and it's resulting in new solutions. But it's also coming with some neoliberal tendencies. For example, gambling is something that has really grown big on the continent. A lot of people are gambling into sports, into supporting all these football teams in the world. And they are, with their mobile phones, already inserted into paywalls where they are having to pay money, and it's resulting in poverty, because the gambling sometimes they cannot sustain what is happening. But yes, I want also to talk about the way the giant techs or the global media companies, as we had yesterday, like Facebook, Google, have come into Africa. Their arrival has not been haphazard. They have chosen carefully where to locate. Like most of 50% of their of the new tech hubs in Africa, they are in 5 key countries: South Africa, Kenya, Nigeria, Egypt, and Morocco. Why is that? Why are some countries favored? Is it, is it accidental? We need to understand, the factors that are resulting in some countries, like Rwanda, for example, has joined the flame. What are they doing right? How are the government there preparing for this opportunity? And how is it manifested? The, there is a lot of learning that we need to do about the way, for example, in the last 5 years, the tech hubs have developed in African countries. Yeah. Why are some countries left out in the innovation, efficiency, and the inclusion that result from this, according to the World Bank report from 2016? They say if you adopt digital technologies, it has an impact on your development. Yeah. But what exactly does it mean? When you look at Google, they have invested 100 million in Africa to encourage faster internet in African cities. When you look at Uber is a very remote plant. They put in 20 million into Egypt, for example, in 2017, which is geared towards the tax sector, and it has resulted in 700 people employed. When you look at Microsoft, they have a project called For Africa, $75 million, and it's also investing here in South Africa in cloud projects here. When you look at Opera, which is a Norwegian software company, it's also investing in African digital economy to the tune of 100 million. Facebook is involved in Uganda. They are laying pipes in Uganda. Airbnb, they are also in South Africa. They are promoting community-led digital tourism projects. Orange Telecom, they're also here with 56 million for African startups. IBM, they're also at university level. They are investing in at VITS, for example, in innovation spaces, and they are sponsoring new laboratories for incubators and innovation. One of my colleagues who is at VITS was telling me that part of their response to this new digital tech in the classroom is to bring together engineering students and art students in a new course that is geared to maximize understanding this digital. So the digital techs that are emerging, they bring business to the grassroots. They bring new ideas. They bring employment. They also result in better incomes in some cases and improve better standards of living for the unbanked, efficient and pleasure. But there's also a story that is not told much about the high failure rate. A lot of stress. I think quite a lot of, somebody from yesterday was telling us, there are a lot of flops, there are a lot of prototypes. There are also varying degrees of success. There's greater inequality, particularly in its potential to disrupt labor markets. There's also displacement of workers by machines. When I'm in the UK, I'm seeing like at petrol stations, you go, there's nobody there, you just put your fuel in. So in Africa, where there's need for employment, what are our options? What are our priorities? There's also a demand for low skills work, whereby the high skills are the ones that are more in demand. I just wanted to highlight in conclusion the idea of Nollywood as perhaps an industry that has done very well, but also can do better. Nollywood, as you know, is the Nigerian sort of filmmaking enterprise, which is very vibrant. Soon after the release of Black Panther, they launched their own Wakanda Forever 2 days after the release of Black Panther. And part of this is reflective of the innovation that they have, which has made them a $500 million a year annual business. And they are now thought to be ahead of Hollywood and Nollywood in terms of titles that they release every year. Part of their business model is worth highlighting when we are thinking about technologies, because they are doing rather well in considering the investments that they use. The Nollywood model was based on adopting disruptive technologies, digital filming and editing equipment. They have, for example, been voted by UNESCO in 2009. They declared Nollywood, the Nollywood Nigerian film industry as the largest in the world, based on annual output. Yeah. That's according to the UNESCO Institute of Statistics, Institute for Statistics. So the basic Nollywood model is where they take small budgets of about 20 to 75,000. There's a quick turnaround, typically shooting of films is scheduled for 20 to 30 days, high volume. And they also have a local and growing local fan base, a lot of talent. But how they have tried to create a model which pays is something that can be improved, like I said. Because most of their money now, at the moment, 98% of their money comes from home videos. It's changing because of the online. Some of them are going online, like you can watch Nollywood movies, paid on demand online. But for the most part, 98% of their revenues are coming from home video. If you compare with Bollywood, 75% of its revenue comes from theater. Bollywood, 50% of its money comes from home video. Although home videos are now collapsing, they are also going online. But 17% comes from theater. With Bollywood, quite a lot of it was coming from CD sales, $1 CD sales. They lack good infrastructure, such as studios. They are also very much individual, operations. And they are family-run kind of businesses with people investing and getting a quick, return on their money. But nowadays, because of the text, there is a possibility that they embrace pay-per-view online models where the money can go directly to the creators. So with computers, smartphones, we see that they can convene audiences, they can create new ways of making it pay. Nollywood is also known for innovation. For example, they're making books like half of a Hero Son. They're making books into films. It's a level of innovation we should pay attention to. They are also, however, not very good at keeping copyright of what they produce. They sold most of their rights to Movie Magic, which is a South African company. And afterwards, when I went to Nigeria, they told me that some of these deals were really appalling. They could have, negotiated better. So equity financing is what they have, and personal loans, which is not very lucrative. But there is a hope that with more understanding of audiences on the continent, there's a report, those of you are interested, called Look Beyond the Obvious, the Blueprint for Media Strategies in Africa, which came out in 2013. It's a Nelson report on audiences in Africa. It's an area where we have not done well. And the report says, despite sharing a common border, inhabitants of one country differ from inhabitants in other neighboring countries in terms of their attitudes, buying, and media preferences. This degree of diversity poses a challenge to marketers who cannot ignore individual country preferences when working within and across geographies. When I saw this, I said, in academia, we have been aware of this a long time ago. But what they discovered in the report is quite important for media management, especially, that we need to target audiences in a better way. We need to understand different ways. I was talking to a colleague from a leading broadcaster saying that they don't do surveys. They don't know who is engaging. They rely on when people complain about signals. That's when they know that they are reaching this part of the area. And it's very important to have audience research so that we understand who we are targeting. I want to conclude by highlighting that the ideas about the new tech giants coming to Africa, it can be very good, but it also places a challenge on us as academics, as media managers, to try and understand exactly how it can be more relevant for us. According to one commentator, they said these big giants, they're dictating Africa's tech future. They are locking us into a rat race to catching on the goal that is the African digital content consumers. Each has come up with its own campaign strategies. For example, Facebook and Google are the most aggressive, and they entice consumers with freebies. Facebook is offering internet.org to users, and Google is also partnering with Safaricom to give free zones in Kenya. And the argument here is that with these, we are all being dragged into the system. Once we are properly engaged, we are going to pay dearly for the other services, values that come with that. So there is need for policymakers also to wake up to the task. It's not just big business coming in with opportunities for employment. There are also competing choices. We need to understand where they are coming from, who they are, so that we prioritize our own interests. For example, the issues about media that foster citizenship, media that the public service angle, we need to understand how does it survive in this digital age. We need to think about the synergies that can be developed between them and say media that foster citizenship, alternative media, community media. How are they going to stand in relation to these tech giants? We need also to think about the continent as a continent with people in the diaspora. How does it work? To have markets that are here and markets that are outside. The African media can also have influence into markets where these tech giants are coming from. There are some gaps which we can take advantage of. I have a lot of questions I wanted to raise at the end about the kind of innovation and individual creativity that come with this. But I will try to leave that. And also I wanted to ask the extent to which decoloniality issues of values can apply to media managers. Can media managers be immune from that kind of discussion? But I will stop there. Thank you very much. I'm sorry, the technical did not work, so we say the time. But thank you very much. I don't think we have time for questions. Unless somebody.
I mean, we could take a couple of questions, although we are running a little behind now.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, maybe anyone who wants to ask him questions, maybe.
Thank you very much. My name is Mashiro Boluka from South Africa. And I enjoyed your presentation, but there are a few maybe pointers that I wanted to take your head on my point. All of us are really embracing globalization, but I think there are a few issues or two in particular that I want to focus on. The governance issues, including issues around privacy and so forth. If you look at these global role players, they only account in their countries of origin. Therefore, whatever governance lapses that they may have in those foreign countries, they don't have to account. I mean, I don't see Facebook coming to account to our parliament on how, what they're going to do around the privacy of information for our own citizens. Now, how do we deal with that moving forward? Because they only account, whether they are stock exchanges, they operate in accordance with the rules or requirements of their own stock exchanges. Here they can only list practices under listing, therefore they don't have to comply with South African rules. And the second issue is, how do we arrest large capital outflows? Like we have been saying, where do these companies operate? South Africa, Nigeria, and Egypt. And all of us are in need for development. But how do we ensure that indeed there isn't any large capital flows? Because even if Facebook or Google are operating somewhere, the amount of money that leaves the country at a time when we need capital for our own development, I think quite scary. And how do we really address that? So for our own economic development, so that the whole thing of globalization is not a one-win situation, but at least it's win-win on both sides.
Yeah, thank you very much. Those are very important questions. I'll start with the last one. The how to address the issue of capital flows. I think this is a very continental-wide question that we should all be posing. But it's something that I live in London, and something that is also a global question. Because these global techs, they employ the best minds. They employ lawyers, they employ the best economists. They are always ahead of the curve. And what we need to do is to develop regulation that is responsive to this. In most African countries, the regulations are so old. The discussion we had yesterday, whether these are media companies or technological companies. In Africa, I think we still treat them as maybe engineering kind of setups, but they have implications. They are diversified. So we need to improve the regulatory aspects. We need to be responsive to the changes in the definition that what is happening. We need to be alert to what is happening. And as Africans, many African countries are part of the International Telecommunications Union. That's a very good source for regulation that are good for countries, whereby the regulatory schemes, yes, there are questions about how the ITU is doing some of the regulation, but in most cases, one can argue that the public service interest is still very much protected by the regulatory mechanism from the International Telecommunications Union, of which most countries in the world, including almost all in Africa, are members. Then the idea of how do we stop capital flows? I think normally when you want to make money, you have to create conditions where investors can come and where you disarm them, they come with confidence. In Zimbabwe, where I was born, where there's a new regime, what they are doing is not untypical of most countries. You develop an investment climate which is very permissive. So they say, well, all investors can take back all their profit, they can repatriate. Nothing wrong with that, but you need to think also about what else do they give to the community. So investors don't invest unless they get profit. So we need to be aware of how to secure our interests, as well as meet their own interests. Otherwise, they don't come. So it's something that rests on the parliaments. People need to be much more alert to the business. There's need also for academics to do research that helps decision makers to get on with it. I hope I've answered your question, Gibson. I quite like your work as well, particularly the concerns about how to Africanize media models without necessarily making them exceptional. And I quite like your work. I think we have to stop here, otherwise the rest of the schedule is going to be ruined. We can continue the conversation at lunch, coffee, and all that. Thank you very much.
You don't mind. So you go second. You want to go second?
Yeah, we need you.
Aim for I'll give you a warning at 12. I yes. Oh, thank you. Thanks. Cheers.
Good morning, everybody. We're going to move directly into our next session. We have a panel discussion with a very interesting group of people that are going to bring, I think you'll see a wide variety of different experiences and different ideas to the topic that we're looking at. The word struggle is in the topic, the economic struggle, and we certainly heard yesterday just how difficult it is for people at the coalface to try and find sustainable revenues that are not entirely dependent on the largesse of others and the generosity of others, to try and develop some kind of interaction with audiences and some kind of way of putting oneself onto a sounder financial footing in this brave 21st century. So these are some case studies and some other insights. They're not all case studies. And we're going to have 4 speakers. You can see in the program who they are, but I'll just introduce them one by one. We are going to try and catch up a little bit of the time because we don't want to run into your coffee and tea time too much. But we're going to start off with Professor Leve Bangio. He's been an associate professor of the School of Communication, Language and Performing Arts at Daystar University in Kenya. Professor Leve.
Thank you very much. We're just going to, good morning. I was going just to start without saying hi, and that's going to be a problem, but then I'll say that I think that's fine. I'm going to look at data, the economic struggles and successes in the case of the Kenyan media, and this works fine for me. Okay. And just looking back at the history of the media in Kenya, we haven't exactly had a very strong tradition of government media. Much of the Kenyan media has been primarily private, predominantly newspapers, television stations, and radio stations. And over the last 3 or 4 years, the growth in that area has been fairly phenomenal. We have had one national broadcaster, the Kenya Broadcasting Corporation, that has been from 1927 straight on and has been primarily the dominant area that the government has had a say. In terms of the breakdown, in terms of the media that we have, we have 4 daily newspapers, We have 60 to 70 television channels. I say 60 to 70 because sometimes some of them get off air, come back on air, and keep on shifting. But predominantly, we have about 5 national stations that broadcast across the country. And then we have over 130 radio stations. About 210 have been licensed, but about 130 are on air that broadcast across, not across the nation. About 4 of them broadcast across the nation. Majority of them broadcast in separate regions in the country. And we're going to break a little bit and look at that. In terms of exploring the challenges that the media industry has been facing in Kenya, I just want to spend a little moment, and this is a conversation that has been held everywhere about the decline in circulation of the media, and comparing that trend over the last several years, from about 2007 to 2015, we notice, for example, the decline in print media circulation from about 4.8 million to about 2 million. Television, the viewership has been declining in spite of the growth in the area, from about 8.2 million to now about 7.3 million in 2015. Radio station, radio spread has also been going down from about 16.6 million in 2007 to about 14 million. And the only area that has been growing phenomenally, I think, is in the mobile area, where we have witnessed the growth almost doubling over the same period. So we had about 8.7 million spread of the uptake in 2007, particularly focusing on the smartphone area, to about 16.6 million in 2015. And as we look at the growth in this area, this particularly interesting is the dominance of one station. This is in the area of television, for example, because the area of television has had a fairly strong increase in terms of following, and particularly with respect to news, that a lot of Kenyans are getting their information and news from the television. But that seems to be playing particularly in one area where one station, Citizen, has got a comparatively large share of the market compared to others that are at the bottom of that pile. Now, the trend has not changed that much. If you look at what from the data that is available from last year, July, August, and June, July, and August 2017, that the incidences of radio are now at about 65%, but over those 2-month periods, you tend to see the decline. And this period was particularly interesting because that's the time that we're having elections, and the elections evidence probably a more heightened interest in the media. The television stations is at 46, 45, 46 during the same period, 3 months. But the newspaper is an interesting area that has remained relatively stagnant, 10% over that 3 periods of last year, 3 months period of last year. And what we're going to witness in the more recent data is that this is declining even since then. Magazine industry had registers, and then we have about 27, 26, 28 instances of internet access, mobile online access for the same period. And the areas that this is actually being witnessed is that the WhatsApp application, the Facebook and Google in that order. But I want to focus attention, I think, when Winston was talking, he made reference to betting in the continent. And Sportspesa, which is essentially a betting company, registers quite a bit of significant interest over that people are accessing it. And the instruments that they're using to access this communication, the dominant one is cell phone, which have over 99%, about 99% incidence, and then laptop computers. And over the same period that the study has been taking place, we noticed a decline in computers and the handheld, that is iPad, for example, that have not had the decline in the usage over the same period. So in terms of looking at the areas of that we're going through, The challenges that we're having with regard to the media that is causing a bit of jitters. The government over the last 6-7 years have introduced an agency called the Government Advertising Agency. The argument that the government had over that period was that they looked at the expenditure that the government was incurring with that advertising. So the government started to put together all advertisements and then use one agency that's housed within the Ministry of ICT to carry out government advertising. Now, government is the fourth largest advertiser in Kenya after the telcos, after the betting companies, and after multi-choice, in that order. And so they spend probably about 10 billion every year in advertising. And so when the government came together and pooled the resources, it meant that there was only one source that the state, that the media were going to be dealing with. But what has happened over the last 3-4 years is that government has not been remitting the money back to the media houses, and therefore starving the media houses of resources which to operate, and that has had quite a bit of an impact. And the lack of government policy, question of organized goods when just looking at the media in totality, security attacks on the media, censorship, particularly by commercial interests that would use that agency to control media, and instances of fake news that we've been going through, are some of the challenges that we've been having. Look at the question of the advertising spent over the last 4 years. And 2017 is particularly significant because of the elections, and therefore there was a lot of spending by candidates who were campaigning, by the government itself, because it was defending its seat. But you sort of see that between 2015 and 2016 that we had quite a decline in terms of the advertising spend, and therefore having quite an impact on in the industry. Now, with regard to the successes that we've had, it's particularly interesting that over the last several years, when the government opened up the airwaves, and particularly for regional broadcasting, the stations that, rather than broadcast across the country, broadcast in specific areas, have had quite a big uptake. First, there's been some significant growth at individual levels in terms of the radio stations. For example, Radio Citizen, between 2007, 2015, and 2018, has had a growth from 19 to 27 to 36 instances. But there's been quite a shift across the board with regard to the stations that have been on air. But I want to pay attention to the rise of vernacular stations. And this is significant because a lot of the audiences that were exposed or were using the national broadcasting agencies, I mean, not national broadcasting, but the stations that are broadcasting across the country, tended to have, that population has gone down, and the population that we've been seeing rising has been with regard to this stations that are broadcasting in vernacular. For example, you see Ramogi, Milele, Maisha, Kamene, etc., that broadcast in vernacular stations. And so, overall, whereas we see continued access to radio, but that access has tended much more to be in the vernacular stations. So, collectively, as an industry, we could say that there's been still some life and presence in that area, but the shift in the dynamics of that presence is of course of interest. And while we're able to see this also reflected in the television industry, for example, the national television, KBC, has had a decline in viewership, but with regard to the vernacular stations, TV stations, Meru TV, Kameme TV, Khas TV, Kikuyu TV, Three Stones, all these are vernacular stations where West, Bete, Njata are recording significant growth, and particularly in the area advertising too, that is recognizable. For example, a station such as Njata spends quite a bit, its revenue is drawn quite a bit from selling of land, small pieces of land that owners were selling. So in the middle of the news story, they'll take a break and start telling about a plot that may be sold in one area or the other, and that's the source of revenue. So the growth in local language broadcast, both for radio and for television, is part of the success that we take note of. And then the spread of radio as a continuing source of information. But it's interesting that comparison between radio and TV. According to the latest data, this is a study that was just completed about a month ago, that 47% of the public receive information through radio, whereas 51% through television. And then we begin to look at the area of social media, the internet, and the other family sources, etc., etc. They're all over on the lower digits. But interestingly is the question of newspapers, that instances have gone really down, that the consumption is at 1%. That is certainly a worry in terms of looking at life of the newspaper, the country. And interesting also has been the question of the economic, the socio-economic income and its impact on the kind of media that citizens draw their information from. And in 2017, at a figure of about 30,000 income per month, you notice that they tended to receive, to depend on information almost at the same level as from whether radio or television. But that changes as time goes by. But the more interest for us here would be with respect to social media and the internet that has remained at below 5%. That was at 5% in 2017. And when you move to 2018, the study concluded in March that there's been no significant difference registered in that. So, except in the area where the connectivity between those who depended on radio and those who depended on TV fell back from about 30,000 to about 9,000 or 8,000 shillings per month. And so what we're tending to see is that there's the socioeconomic impact on the consumption of content from these stations has a bearing on where the mix that they're coming together is. Now, with regard to the confidence in the media, which I think is quite an important element, that we still see a sense in which this public, much as the consumption overall is declining, but they still register very strong confidence in the media at 44%. And when you look at this from the perspective of other institutions in the country, whether it is the church, it's government, it's politicians, etc., the media still remains the most institution that is relied on from the point of confidence, the point of trust, the point of belief. In terms of the changes that we're seeing specifically in the media, the various types of media over the last while, the free newspaper, the People Daily, has registered quite a bit of growth over the last 5 or so years in terms of the overall numbers. Although it's difficult to come with hard statistics in terms of the hard numbers that are selling, but comparatively, the anecdotal data that's available and the information that you get from the media houses themselves speak of strong show of the People Daily. The mainstream media here, the Standard newspaper, the Nation newspaper, have introduced paywall and circulating e-paper and PDF, which are having quite a good uptake, both in terms of their distribution, but also in terms of the revenue that is being harvested from that area. With regard to television, one of the sources of revenue that they have diversified has been betting, and you have a very strong, increasingly strong betting practice that is taking place, whether it is about football or whatever games that are going on as a source of revenue. But the other source of revenue that the stations have is opinion polling. It's not exactly opinion polling, but it's questions that news anchors ask at the end of the bulletin or during the bulletin, and audiences are supposed to respond to them, but they are charged extra when they respond, and part of that revenue is harvested by the media houses that they are using as part of the revenue that they're growing. So those are some of the successes that we see with regard to the media houses. The discussion that we're having has largely been on the question to let a bit broadening. How is this all impacting our practice? And I come from the Academy of Training, of practicing journalism, etc., etc. But I begin to ask myself, why are we so obsessed with what this does to journalism? When in journalism we are focused, we are training our attention on the question of being able to tell our stories, be able to provide stories. And particularly in Africa, where we have been so used to storytelling, the question that this lays to my mind is, are we able to continue telling stories, or is our word what platform those stories are going to tell? And I think it's probably important to ask the NBS of this world to focus attention on what is happening on the means and modes of transmitting or delivering those stories, whereas we in the media houses focus our attention on telling the stories, whatever the platform that may be, so that journalism may thrive, whether it is on a WhatsApp platform, whether it's on a Facebook platform. And so let's go out and just tell our good stories, and let the NBS start worrying about what platform those stories are going to be. We don't have the investors and those guys with us here. Let them worry where the revenue comes from while we tell the stories. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Lily. Thanks very much for that. It's a very good overview of the landscape. I'm sure for those of you that were in the session yesterday, just to notice how uncannily similar some of those trends lines are in terms of how people's news consumption preferences are changing, both in terms of what kind of media they like to get news from, how ethnic and indigenous languages have become more popular and people are wanting to get their news in those languages, and how newspaper readership, in print at least, on kind of steep decline. So I think it's very interesting just to see those parallels. Our next speaker on the panel is Sue Valentine from the Open Foundation in London. Sue work in media is very well known in South Africa in terms of a variety of different initiatives. She's almost a serial social entrepreneur, and certainly today helps social and other entrepreneurs in the media space and the news space across the world. Sue?
Morning, everyone. No, actually, let's leave it because it's you need it connected. That's fine. Next slide. That's fine. No, don't worry. I feel a little bit on shaky ground in a room full of researchers and media economists who have the time to analyze and evaluate possible solutions to the challenges facing journalism, as well as former colleagues and people who really are at the coalface of dealing with the challenges that are very real and are continuing to befuddle and dazzle journalists in a very rapidly changing world. While, of course, as Harry just mentioned, there are regional differences and distinct contexts and specificities, I think that the challenges brought by digital disruption creates a number of common dilemmas, almost globally. Societies might be at different stages, but those challenges, those dilemmas, and I use the word dilemmas rather than problems, dilemmas I think suggests that there's a multiple range of solutions and choices to be made, and not a single silver bullet that's going to solve things. Just a quick word firstly about, so given the context here, I think I need to embrace my current position as part of the donor community to media. And I will talk about some of the conversations and some of what we see from that vantage point in the world. A quick word just about what we do. I'm from what is called the Program on Independent Journalism which is part of the worldwide network of the Open Society Foundations. We have a global remit. We do prioritize in our program journalism in Latin America and Africa, but we also work with journalists in Asia and Europe. We have three main areas in which we function. We support networks of investigative journalists. We support freedom of expression and safety for journalists, online and offline. And then we have a portfolio which is called Opening Journalism, which is the portfolio I coordinate, which is really a response to the way in which journalism has been cracked wide open by digital technology. It's broken the business model, but it has also created opportunities. And so we support startups, we support some level of experimentation, and we support those organizations that are trying to solve whichever problems they identify for themselves in order to make themselves stronger, more resilient, more relevant, and able to produce quality storytelling and distribute it and engage their audiences and hopefully earn some revenue. So from our position, how do we see the challenges and opportunities? Allow me a quick sketch of our assumptions of how we've got to this dilemma. I'm sure you'll recognize this. Once upon a time, journalism was the authoritative voice. It mediated the flow of information. It controlled the communication from government to citizens, from citizens back to government, and sometimes even from citizens to one another. It told us what happened, and if it was any good, it also told us why things happened. This journalism lived mostly in media houses. They became profitable by access to the information that they conveyed, and profitable by delivering audiences to advertisers. People needed journalists. Journalists enjoyed this power. They talked a lot. They listened a little. Then came the internet. Information is available on demand. Social media arrived. People told their own stories. Politicians and advertisers talked directly to their constituencies. The platforms grew. They took the news, they posted it anyway. Trusted brands, experienced journalists, appeared in news feeds devoid of context, wallowing in a murky world of truth and lies. Increasingly, as the algorithms decided what we should see, journalism has been displaced, and critically, it's lost its connection to its audience. So the point of my very oversimplified history, in this brave 21st century, information is plentiful, attention is not. Audiences can tune out or tune in. To survive, journalism must work a lot harder for attention. We've seen one response, clickbait, ultimately disrespectful of the audience and increasingly be rejected by media consumers. So from what we see ultimately, we believe that journalism needs to cultivate a relationship with its audience most of all. It needs to be valuable and relevant, and in order to do this, it needs to learn to listen. Those who follow European media trends will have seen how Le Monde in France has completely revived its fortunes and turned around how it's doing its journalism. One of the architects that spoke about the fact that content is no longer the only part of what the news media is all about. It's about content, it's about events, and it's about critically the relationship with the audience. The journalist's job, according to him, is that journalists need to protect the integrity of their brand. They need also to do something they haven't done before very much. They need to be transparent. They need to invite the audience to doubt, to show the evidence of how they produce their stories. And as a sign of respect, in that dialogue, produce the journalism and place it in front of people, and then be able to listen back. One example just from Lamont in terms of talking about how they've responded to what they see might be relevant around them is that they've produced, they signed up 50,000 subscribers to a news service that would produce just 16 editions, tracking, instead of following Trump every single day in the media, tracking over 16 editions what's happening in the US, and people paid to get something that actually distilled this information and produced it in a thoughtful way. Who else is trying new approaches to try to relate to audiences better and serve their needs? Some of you might know of a thing called the membership puzzle. Anyone heard of it? Am I talking to you? Yeah. Okay. Membership puzzle is a combined initiative from Jay Rosen, who's at the New York University, and The Correspondent, a Dutch news site. It's running from, it started May 2017, runs until May 2019. And the premise is to look for how you build revenue through relationships with the audience. The Correspondent in the Netherlands is advertising free. It's responsive to its members. They have about 56,000 signed up members who pay about $65 a year. 21 full-time journalists who pursue the beats, the obsessions they call it, that they find interesting and relevant, and they involve readers and ask for their help in how best to tell these stories. Another organization, not just from the north, who's also part of the membership puzzle, is in the small country of Uruguay, only 3 million citizens, a news site called La Diaria. They launched in 2006 with the promise to cover only what matters. They printed first in 2006 and created their own distribution networks, not to hand that over to the bigger news companies in the country. And in 2015 went digital. They rely on a membership model that has 79% of their revenue comes from members, 15% comes from advertising. They've recently launched a new series of verticals covering health, work, education, science, feminism, and sport. And they've promised their members that if they're trying to reach 100% of their revenue covered by membership, and they promise that they will then use that 15% to launch new journalism projects that their members can select and ask them to pursue with that additional money. Their motto, according to their general manager, is that innovation is the daughter of scarcity, and scarcity is our identity. It's the ongoing challenge that they see for themselves. Another example from the north, some of you might know of a news site in Spain called El Diario.es. They started in 2012, and in the space of the last 6 years have become the second biggest news site in Spain. They have almost 11 million users, and their job, as they see it, is to not to manage the silence, but rather how do we manage the noise, and how do we distinguish ourselves and be relevant to our audience. And so their thinking again is to draw on members and to provide information that they know from their relationship with their members they will find relevant, useful, and meaningful, and they deliberately are not including advertising that muddies the waters and causes people to question whose interests are being served. In a much smaller market, Venezuela, the country, as you know, is in hyperinflation, hugely fractured. You have a small news outfit, Efecto Cocuyo, started in 2013. Efecto Cocuyo means the firefly effect, meaning little fireflies lighting up the world. They're digital only, it was the only option. News with spiraling inflation, newsprint was simply unaffordable. It was started by journalists who were frustrated by the levels of censorship in mainstream newsrooms. they are reliant largely on donor funding, but they started also with a crowdfunding campaign and went out into the streets of Caracas and raised nearly 10% of their initial revenue. And people gave money saying, on the condition that we see you back here again, that you don't take our money and forget about us. You tell our stories, you come back to us, and we continue that relationship. In 2014, another Venezuela, in this country as torn apart as Venezuela, there's a proliferation of small media trying to do what they can. El Pitazo means the whistle, as in whistling for attention and alert, works on the basis of citizen journalists and editors who then work and connect those stories. They're active in all 23 states of Venezuela. They have 5 million readers a month. They earn their money from, largely they have some donors and benefactors, and another 10% actually from crowdfunding in the country. And there are 11 different platforms constantly looking for ways to actually reach out and connect with the audience. We see similar energetic, agile models happening in Colombia, Mexico, El Salvador, Guatemala, in places where I think countries are poor, societies are somewhat divided between rich and poor, but nonetheless, there is journalism happening that is trying to respond to their audience. The other ways in which I think journalism needs to be thinking about how to do things differently is thinking about how we tell the stories. And just three quick examples. One, the Germans here might well know about Korrektiv, investigative news website in Germany. One example, one big story that they investigated was on right-wing terror. They produced a huge, long investigative story that only the devoted would read in long form. They then produced it as a graphic novel. Weißer Wolf is what it was called. It became a bestseller. It's been used and prescribed in schools. They then thought about how else do we reach a new audience and take this information to people. They created an exhibition, and they take this exhibition can be popped up and created in cities around the country. And so taking those stories to new audiences in different ways. Another example, the Center for Investigative Reporting. It's based in the US. However, they have looked for other ways to reach their audience, not just through creating a podcast, but partnering with a theatre company. And I love the examples given in the first session this morning by Dr. Malik, looking at Nollywood and the need for us to be thinking, for journalists to be thinking about different partnerships, different ways in which to tell stories. And through the Center for Investigative Reporting, they create these stories, collaborations between artists and journalists, and take these stories to audiences, and then have Q&A sessions afterwards. So not just telling the story, but also exposing the way in which journalism works and opening that up to people to see it in a different light. The last example I'll mention is something I just came across very recently. It's based in France, and it's become a tiny company with just 4 people, but actually managing to be profitable, and it's called Live Magazine. And they basically curate a show with journalists who, for the first time very often, actually get up and tell the stories that they might have worked on. And they will produce a show of 5 or 7 journalists speaking for not more than 10 minutes to actually tell how and why they did, to tell the story of any particular piece of work that they researched on. And in the program that they hand out, they create a theatre experience. They say, instead of turning pages, enjoy the show. There's no taping or rewinding, nor instant replay. It's all in the here and now, a living ephemeral newspaper. The only way to catch it is in person. The only trace is the program in your hands and the memory of tonight. So in a world of digital, where everything is digital, what is the audience valuing? It's actually that moment of connectedness with another audience. They're managing to fill theatres of 1,000 people and more to actually pay money to come and hear journalism being told to them. So lastly, just to conclude, there's no sign that the rapidly changing environment is slowing down. We don't know what will happen. But I think what we do know is that the media need to be listening, they need to be collaborative in their storytelling, they need to build communities, and then they also need to do what they know best. They need to produce the stories that are verified and contextualized, and they must continue to engage with their audiences. Thank you.
Thanks, Sue. That's fascinating. Reminds me of a conversation that we were having yesterday, the point that you were making about building audiences and people wanting journalism performed. And I think it was Matthew Buckland that made the point yesterday about how the music industry has had to reinvent itself from something that sold people content, just like we've always done as journalists, to a space where the performance becomes the absolute key generator of revenue. And the other pieces are just advertising for that. So the idea of coming to the theatre to get your journalism, it kind of takes one back to the 16th century in Germany and France, where people would walk around and give news and shout news out, and the people's walls in El Salvador, and where there was much more of a performance. Certainly the African tradition of oral storytelling and relaying the news from distant places. So maybe we need to start performing more and monetizing it, mixing acting with journalism. Our next speaker is Mapi Mfangu, Editor-in-Chief of NCA. Mapi has got a long and very distinguished record in South African journalism, and of course the NCA now was the first, and I think it's certainly still the most prominent 24-hour news service that South Africa has. It's not the one I was talking about yesterday, the other 24-hour news service. It is the one with much more credibility and standing among journalists. Mapi.
Good morning. In dealing with economic struggles and successes in the media in the great 20th century, I think it's important for us to just get a brief overlook of the structure of the broadcasting sector in South Africa, particularly news and television. It is an oligopoly where there are three dominant players, being the SABC, being MultiChoice, and being Media Holdings that I work for. There are a lot of interdependencies between these three groups, in a sense that MultiChoice is the only paid platform in South Africa and is dominating that sector. We in media, as well as SABC, provide content for MultiChoice, and in that sense, particularly when it comes to news, they pay us a certain fee to produce news for their platform. And therein lies a problem in terms of business models currently that exist, is that 24-hour news channels are solely dependent on that funding from MultiChoice, whereas in our business models, that MultiChoice gave us a certain amount of money to produce this content. We also then get revenue from advertising. It's very similar to SABC. SABC got funding from government, but still they largely depend on advertising. The problem with our interdependence with MultiChoice is that MultiChoice, enjoying the advantage of being the only pay TV in South Africa, have the luxury of changing advertising cards, introducing very cheap advertising cards, and then these advertisers come to SABC and eMedia are asking for very same advertising rates, which both the players, we cannot sustain it because we don't receive money from subscription. So that's where the biggest problem is in terms of how the media industry operates in South Africa and how we get our revenue. In that structure where we all are going for the same kind of revenue, the problem is that as media organizations, we have realized that our business model is not sustainable. We cannot only rely on multi-choice. We cannot only rely on advertising, because advertising pays just a third of our operating costs. And then companies have seek to diversify and reimagine themselves by opening other platforms. In our case, in Media Holdings, we have a platform called OpenView. They were open, but this has created a very it has created tension between us and multi-choice, because multi-choice never imagined they would compete in their space, which is set-top boxes. And as a result of that competition, we've seen multi-choice reducing the amount that it pays to ENCA, which solely depend on that revenue to run this the 24-hour news channel. So what is happening is that both, whether it's Media Holdings or SABC and even multi-choice, is reimagining itself. If you look at this platform, it's mostly English and it's mostly higher LSM. So what is happening in South Africa in terms of higher LSM is that those are the LSM, very limited as they're very powerful in terms of treating advertising. But what they are doing, they're the ones who are migrating to online platforms. And when they migrate to online platforms, big companies used to advertise on television to target these players are no longer spending their advertising money on channels, because they know where to find their customers. They are going directly to that. And I think what we're doing in terms of media owners is that we are also not distracting. We're allowing advertisers to be disruptors, in a sense that we've seen a reduction in advertising revenue, not only driven by the fact that they are migrating to online, but it's also driven by our economic conditions. We all know yesterday, last year, South African bank ratings were decreased. We got the minus status, and as a result, banking stocks lost a lot of money. And where did they cut when they're in that situation? The first thing that they've cut their spending in advertising, and the banking sector, the financial sector in general, has been one of the main advertisers on television. So we have lost that. But still, we continue in our model to try and attract that advertising, where it's the kind of advertising that we're not going to get back anytime soon, because of the economic conditions that we are currently facing. Which brings me to the topic then, with what is the challenge of running a commercial channel and a commercial news channel? So I have I would say it's very unlikely position of being both the editor-in-chief as well as managing director, which means I need to be in charge of journalism and edit, but at the same time, I run a business that must make money. Now, I don't know whether this is going to be the new model for news organizations, given the fact that we don't have money to play around to hire big bosses to do different things at a different time. But the challenge that such a situation increases is that I have the advantage of speaking directly to my boss, ESCO, about the requirements, and there is no line. I can get whatever I want from the ESCO immediately. I don't have to wait for a business person to try and argue my point. But at the same time, because I'm very close to issues about whether we're making money and not making money, there is a temptation sometimes to think more, to wear more an MBA head rather than an editor's head. What do I mean about that is that whereas many years we had a saying in television that said television and news broadcasting is 90% journalism and is 10% entertainment. Now, you need to differentiate yourself as new channels are being introduced. There is that temptation now of saying entertainment 20% and journalism 80%, because you need to rock and shock your viewers in order to keep them watching the rest of the television. So there are challenges in that sense, and every day I'm trying to reconcile the two roles and say, I'm the editor, at the same time, I must make sure that the business is making money. What has been the impact on journalism, the kind of challenges that we've seen, the decline of revenue, is that we are asking more of our journalists. If you look at the 24-hour news formats in South Africa and you look at the stage where South Africa is in, we've gone past through the stage of having just a bad guy and a good guy. People are complex and the issues that we are dealing with as a nation are complex. If you look, for example, at what has been happening in business, because it's always been easy to cover government. It's a low-hanging fruit. You've got access to material online and you can be hysterical about government failing to implement or government abusing your taxpayers' money. We haven't been able to pay that kind of attention to the business community. We're currently sitting with a situation of standoff where for many years the company was just was not run accordingly because of the traditional relationship between business reporters or financial reporters and the business community. They were unable to break those stories because there's close proximity. If you cover standoff, I'm sure there are some of the journalists who got freebies to go to Germany to go to their annual conference. As a result of that, you almost believe the first phase of their results. And how many really journalists can read results and interrogate those results? They always go to an executive summary. So we don't have the depth to cover the news that as a country that is 23 years old, the news that is out there, and to mine the kind of data that is out there. We expect our journalists day in and out to be able to tell the story for 24 hours. There's not enough time for research. And if you look other than the SABC, there is no institution who's spending that amount of money on research. So the kind of research that these journalists are depending on is research on Google. And they don't have the eye of saying, who wrote this research? They don't have an eye to say, okay, even though this is on Wikipedia, it just doesn't make sense. I need to go to secondary and another primary set of information. So they are running from 6 o'clock, they are live on air telling the story. So journalism had suffered as a result. In fact, in South Africa, we've been lucky with smaller institutions like your Daily Maverick, like your Mail and Guardian, because then we tend to follow their investigation because we're not spending enough money on investigation. What then that has done is, if you look at the kind of interest of the stories that Mail and Guardian would go for and stories that Daily Maverick would go for, are not the stories, necessary stories that you think the mass audience that you are broadcasting to are going to go for. So we've created a situation where we all go for the story about how terrible the Zuma administration is. Whereas if you look at the experiences of people in different areas, particularly in rural areas, they've experienced the Zuma administration in simplest terms that I used to go to the river to get water, and now they're running to the tap. And they want you in your broadcasting to actually acknowledge that that has been their experience. But because the ownership, the narrative is owned by the elite in South Africa, the story is more focused only on corruption, and how we cover those corruption is just taxpayers' money. And you have been able to bring the story down to the people to say, if we say it's taxpayers' money, it means that your kids were supposed to get money to go to varsity for free. They didn't get that money because your politician A took that money and used it for something else. I think we've generally failed in terms of, if you look at journalism in terms of doing that. I mean, the big thing for this conference is collaboration. Even though the collaboration has been focused on big tech companies, I want to just take a closer look at collaboration in the continent. Now, we have all as journalists dreamed of this Pan-Africanist agenda. But if you look at media ownership currently in the continent, there is no, and people who started Pan-African channels, they've all closed down because of the kind of new owner that it is. You know, the kind of media owners that we have, they want immediate results, they want instant gratification. They don't realize that sometimes to enter into new markets is a long-term investment if you're not going to get the results in the 5 years. We had TVC opening a Pan-African channel in Nigeria. They've closed that. We as e-media as well opened ENCA Africa, and we closed that after eight years because of a number of challenges. Whereas in South Africa, we still have Nielsen. We can actually know that who we're talking to, and we can go to advertisers and say these are our ratings. there is no credible rating mechanism in the rest of the continent. So we were beaming this material, and we didn't know who was washing this material. The challenge with this is that we have a situation once again that we have been crying for years, where CGTV, former CCTV, has more bureaus in the continent than any other local broadcaster. We're in a situation where BBC is investing more on the continent than any other broadcaster. So once again, the story of the continent is being told through the eyes of former colonizers, and is being told through the eyes of people who are coming to the continent, not for the interest of free media, but also for the interest of extending their foreign policy. It's no mistake that BBC is investing more in the continent. It's not only doing that in media. You see this morning, BA announced that they are opening another route, a direct flight from KZN to London. So it tells you that it's a bigger agenda, it's a bigger economic and diplomatic agenda for them. It's the same thing with the Chinese. They have no interest there. They have no interest in media freedom, in the government of those countries. They have interest in being present there in order to showcase their foreign policy. So again, we are sitting with a situation where we really don't have a pan-African channel in the true sense. What do we do then in that space? Because no one is willing to invest in the unknown. What are the available opportunities for the channel, for different media players in the continent to collaborate? One of the things that I'm looking at, for example, going around doing some form of a 1 hour exchange with, whether it's KTN in Kenya, where you say, we are going to give you 1 hour of our news, and you will exchange that with giving us your 1 hour of a news bulletin. And the same thing going to Ghana, TV3, and say, we want 1 hour of your bulletin, we're going to get 1 hour. Just and start sensitizing Africans to actually care more about Africans, because another problem is that Africans like to say they are pan-Africanists, and believe me, numbers say they are not. Because if you have 40 people dying in Nairobi or even in Ethiopia, they care more about 3 people who were killed in France. It's just what it is. I mean, I remember there was a year in the shooting of the mall in Kenya where I spent half of the budget that year because we're broadcasting live from there. And we thought, we're happening. And when you look at the ratings at the end of the day, it was like complete waste of money because they don't care. It's another African country. It's not the country on their 20 things to do. I want to go to France. I want to go to New York. So we still need to sensitize ourselves with our content, with who we are, and reimagine ourselves through broadcasting. And for us to do that, media owners will have to sacrifice profits just to create an Africa that we want.
Thanks, Moby, for that fascinating set of insights. And I do believe that something that we have to face, one of the elephants in the room, as I think Phil was referring to it yesterday, is precisely that reverence, I think, for things that are not made here. You know, that if it's made here, whether here in South Africa or Kenya or Uganda, we somehow devalue our own product and our own productivity. And we've all noticed the amazing resources that the BBC has put in to covering Africa. And it's great to have that coverage, but as Murphy says, it comes with all sorts of problems. What is the motivation? What is it about? And why can't we generate, in a sense, a greater enthusiasm for our own stories? And that's as true in the country. Trying to get urban people to care about rural people in this country is just as much of a challenge in terms of audience and ratings. Our last speaker on our panel today is an ex-colleague of mine, still a colleague of mine, but an ex-Rhodes University colleague, Jude Matherine, senior lecturer in journalism at the Cape Peninsula University of Technology, and also a serial academic and thinker and an analyst. And Jude, welcome.
I'd like to start out, and by the way, apologies, I've got fighting a cold. I'd like to start out with a bit of a provocation. The topic was economic struggles and successes of media, case studies from the coalface of selected regions. I'd like you to think about the last decade. What media companies or institutions have been presented to you as case studies? Are you thinking? On the source of my study? All right, so while we still battle to get our text sorted, and it appears that my presentation has failed. All right, so if you were thinking about these case studies, the ones that obviously spring to mind would be public broadcasters, The Nation, The Standard, E-News, Naspers. In my experience, in my view, these are the low-hanging fruit for researchers. They deal with media that have more in common with the Western developed world and are consequently more interesting to the Western developed world. And my view is that while this is useful in their own right, often don't represent examples or address the examples of the real struggles that the broader media sector at the coalface are actually grappling with. And so my title, which unfortunately we can't get to, my title was actually, don't worry about it. My title was actually No Case Study. No case study, whether the viability of media in Southern Africa. I found through personal experience that the institutions that we raise, with very little exception, are the dominant media players in Southern Africa. And the problem is that they're the kind of exception, they're the outliers. And you know, if one needs to analyze the sustainability of media, you need to consider various integrated multidimensional indicators for media development, not just the big companies and or not just how one company is turning a profit, or not just how one company is providing specific innovation. I'm pleased that, for one, I don't see Robert Picard here, but I'm really pleased that Robert Picard with UNESCO is working on a series of media viability indicators. I think this is really important to be able to see exactly what is happening with our media. The truth is that most media in Southern Africa are not like these outliers. They're not commercially sustainable. And most are not centered in African countries with high GNI like Kenya, Nigeria, or South Africa. It's a pity that I don't have my presentation because I was going to show this. So they're not in areas of high GNI. Most are not listed companies that can access investments. They're not vertically, horizontally integrated like News24, the Nation Group. They aren't oriented for economies of scale. They aren't even converged. Some have online sites, but most are barely affected by questions of online revenue. We don't even know if these media entities are profitable because the reporting standards being that as private companies, their balance sheets are opaque. So instead, I thought it would be useful to discuss what is the context for media in Southern Africa and how this affects viability generally. Southern Africa, and more specifically the countries in SADC, have a common experience as sites of struggle against European mercantilism, first of all, then colonialism, then neo-colonialism, obviously now globalization. These struggles have left their mark on the land, the politics, economy, culture, and of course the cultural industries. When we look at the region, most countries are developing economies with more than a handful of least developed countries, including Angola, Lesotho, Swaziland. The region is underpinned by various forms of governance, including absolute monarchies like Swaziland and constitutional monarchies like Lesotho and multi-party democracies like South Africa and Botswana, and countries emerging from one-party rule like the DRC, and then of course you also had Zambia has now entered into a multi-party context. And my pages on this one. All right. Many of them, of course, are transitioning from authoritarian rules and regimes, but many maintain the hallmarks of authoritarian media systems. And this is one of the major impediments to actual media development and to the growth of media economies in those areas. So, for example, public or government-run print, news, and TV outlets exist. They're subsidized from the public purse, but they will still get advertising since government can't afford recoverable costs. So this norm means that media companies in this space, commercial media companies, are competing directly with the 500-pound gorilla and competing head-to-head with your major national broadcaster. By as late as 2003, 71% of African TV networks were still under state control, while 61% of newspapers, 84% of television networks were similarly controlled by state agencies. And of course, profitability in some cases was also tied to political access. Not only do you have these nominal public broadcasting state entities, but if you happen to have connections to the dominant party or the oligarchy, then you're also in the power seats. In the region, as elsewhere in the world, ownership of the media for profit cannot be untied from politics. Public Eye in Lesotho and the Post in Zambia discovered this when governments stopped advertising and subscribing to the newspapers due to critical media coverage. And of course, that has a chilling effect on the media. In South Africa, through a network of influence, the Gupta-owned 887 that Harry was talking about was subsidized by preferential treatment from the public broadcast SABC, which provided access to its archives and gave it national coverage for its sponsored ministerial breakfasts. Satellite TV provider MultiChoice allegedly increased its payment to the company from 50 million to 140 million rand a year in exchange, allegedly, for influence over SA's digital encryption policy and subscriptions services. It's not uncommon for critical media in African media spaces and even advertising African media to be told as you are supporting the opposition. This is a subtle veiled threat, a form of flack, which chills both critical media coverage and advertising support. Cheerleading for government, or at least keeping your mouth shut, can be good for business. Politics and policy also play an important part in media density. If you've ever been to DRC around elections, you'll see all of a sudden you've got lots more newspapers that suddenly open up and then shut down. And of course, in some cases, the laissez-faire approach to media policy means that, as you've been seeing in Kenya, that you've got all these licenses, but you don't have radio stations that are actually operational. The same thing is also happening in Zambia as well. Sorry, I've suddenly lost my order. So markets are also generally small. I mean, the newspaper market, and particularly newspaper, is important, so markets are small. National daily newspaper distribution is still a challenge. I'm on the board of a small national media company. In a country like South Africa, this newspaper comes out weekly. The subscribers get the newspaper allowed to distribute. So markets are generally small. And of course, you've also got the additional issue in the region of illiteracy. About 65% of youth in sub-Saharan Africa can read or write with understanding, and illiteracy affects more women. And of course, when you have low literacy, that has impact on your mobility and income levels. And then, of course, it's a matter of choice. Writing in 2010, Banda writes that the cost of a newspaper at 10 kwacha, $1 at that time, was unaffordable for most people who were more likely to opt for a loaf of bread, which also sold for 10 kwacha. So newspaper subscriptions are rare in much of the region. Most media houses depend on on-street copy sales. This means that to increase circulation numbers, newspapers have to be distributed as widely as possible. But poor road infrastructure and distribution networks mean that large areas of rural areas, the majority of people live, are very poorly serviced with newspapers, which means that we have to look at radio and mobile. Newspapers remain concentrated in urban centers with varying growth patterns across countries. It's getting tough getting those daily newspapers out on time, as I had indicated. I'm waiting for the day, Bilal, where we can actually have drones that maybe bypass your newspapers and drop them off in a remote area, because that's the only way I can see around this. And then, of course, what's raised at a lot of these conferences is the benefits and hopes of the internet. Now, for the big media companies, the issues of internet revenues are really important. And it's true the internet does fill a gap for access to news in some spaces, particularly for the diaspora. But while many African newspapers have an online version, this does not mean that they reach more than a limited part of the population. And while certainly mobile internet, which is what most of the region, how most of the region gets its internet, while mobile internet is certainly growing, your 3G coverage tends to be fairly patchy, and of course data costs are incredibly high, and that would have been another presentation. So if you just Google ICASA 2017 data packages, you'll see, for example, that Mozambique and DRC have some of the lowest prices for a 1 GB bundle, whereas countries like Zimbabwe and even South Africa have the highest cost, and it's the same company in much more difficult environments and trading conditions. So access to broadband and cost is still a major impediment. According to WAN IFRA's report, financially viable medium emerging developing economies, 36% of the print newspapers in emerging democracies reported no internet revenue in 2013, compared to 6.2% of print newspapers in the developed markets. And even where the newspapers are earning revenues from the digital editions, as we know, this constitutes usually about less than 10% of total revenue. All right, so if the internet isn't delivering and newspapers are limited, what are we left with? Well, we're left with satellite television, which is under the control of the state, and we're left with radio. And so radio is obviously the growth, is still a growth area. In truth, radio still has the largest penetration, and given its distribution in vernacular languages, as Levy was indicating, remains ever popular. Digital migration, good people, has been a non-starter. In SADC, only Malawi, Tanzania, Namibia, and Mauritius have migrated, while countries like South Africa are still in the pilot phase. Mashiro, is that true? Where digital migration has happened, the sale of frequencies to the highest bidder has mainly, though not exclusively, benefited the existing big media companies, and the digital dividend has not trickled down. And then, of course, we get to lack of access to finance. So if you're a big company, you're listed, you might get access to finance. And while we have some organizations in the region, we used to have SAMDEF. I'm just looking around. Does SAMDEF still exist? Anybody know if SAMDEF still exists? We have SAMDEF, we have SIMED. People looking at me physically, it's a problem. SAMDEF, Johanna shaking it, doesn't really exist. All right, so we have MDIF and some local organizations that are looking to provide some investment to smaller media organizations. But the truth is, in the region, media philanthropy and assistance is a revenue source. It gets put on the list, and it particularly benefits those organizations that have the people that can go and 2 minutes, oh dear, can go and look after this funding. A lot of the new funders, by the way, are coming through in the form of the Gates Foundation, the Armadura Network, OSF, etc. But they're driven by a very strong digital drive, which is indicated as a fairly limited use if the operating conditions on the ground haven't changed. And then I'm just going to skip over a lot of the stuff. I'm going to jump to this last point, which is you can't change what you can't measure. There are 54 countries in Africa, and measurement of the media spaces in them and research of these media spaces are incredibly problematic. The Pan-African Media Research Organization currently runs AMPs in about only half of those African countries. The availability of regular, credible, and detailed data about the state of national media markets is a major impediment to more sophisticated media buying and planning for local organizations. It impedes the development of content and scheduling and programming and pricing that is more responsive to market needs. And of course, everyone thinks about it, why on earth would I want to, as a company, invest in very expensive market research when the market is so distorted? When, for example, in some countries like Lesotho, the largest advertiser is the state, and it will distribute that to news organizations that are not competitive with it. Where the cost of audience market research is high, but there's no direct benefit from being able to get better value from the competition because the other is politically connected, media businesses might be more reluctant to invest in more sophisticated offerings. Another consideration is that given the size of some local audiences, media companies with small audiences don't really want you to know what their figures are. All right, so it's high time the researchers took another serious look at the operating environment, the context for media development, and sustainability of independent mass and network media in the region. While commercial sustainability is important, any analysis of the interplay between all other components of the media ecosystem must consider other elements for the development of quality sustainable media, such as policy, audience measurement, ethical regulation, media literacy, and media education itself. And this needs to get put back on the table. I thank you.
Thank you, Jude. We do have a little bit of a time problem. We've had 4 very excellent and full presentations, but we are now running into tea. But I would very much like to just take some very brief questions. If you could keep your questions just to a quick question, that would be great. And if there aren't any questions, then of course we will have tea. But I think we've had a lot of provocations from all 4 of our speakers. So has anybody got a quick question to any of or 2? Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you. I'm Wongibi Emmanuel from Cameroon. We've heard a lot about the challenges for media in this age of tech giants, to a point that one might leave from here very scared what is happening tomorrow. But I worry very much about whether we should be so worried. I don't share the idea that we should just stay back, as one of the presenters said, and say our business is storytelling and let the rest take care of itself. I think that would be suicidal. But I do not also believe either in an over concentration on where the economics goes. And my concern is, as media organizations, I think there are 2 things we're not doing right. While we are carrying these discussions here, oftentimes within our media organizations, we do not hold these discussions. And it is oftentimes among ourselves, practitioners who are working every day, that we will get the cost-effective, the less expensive solutions to the problems that seem to look like mountains to us today. Are we, as media organizations, creating the environment where we are not only informing other people, but not talking amongst ourselves? I am afraid that there are very innovative solutions, easy, but we are not bringing the stakeholders into this problem, into the discourse. And that's why we are all impressed by what other people are doing, the Googles of this world are doing, and forgetting the ingenuity that will come from within. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Anybody else got a quick comment? If we could just keep them to very short and quick comments. Yes, go ahead. Then Francis. 2 minutes. Go ahead. Francis.
Yeah, just wanted
Otherwise, just shout it out. The mic's not working.
Yes, thanks for that. I found this fascinating, but I have been exercised by what you said yesterday, Harry, and a lot of the conversations that about what's happening in the African media space and in others, which see as a solution, first see as a failure government policy and regulation, and then present at the end the solution being more regulation and government policy. I find that fascinating that you raise both those things at tail ends as both the problem and the solution. The other thing that I've, that you, from my own research, and was reiterated by what Sue said to me, and what was just the comment that was just made prior to mine, is that we have empirical evidence that entrepreneurial leaders find solutions and deliver profits to companies across the globe in every market environment. That's what's happening in Venezuela, that's what's happening in other places. The fact that organizations lament that the existing business model is challenged and then say, and in your report, as a friend who says that we support the media business, we should support a media business, but not the media business. Some of these institutions are in decline because of their own lack of innovation. And that is a natural process. And others will come up, and I think we should take a look at that. But this sense that we are talking about here as a right to exist as we are, and that this is some sense of an inalienable right and injustice done to us, that we can't continue doing the stuff we've done always in the same ways we've always done it, is a kind of rhetoric that I think is unhealthy and unhelpful in finding solutions. And this is an economics conference, and I think that we need to take a look seriously about how innovation and change can help the media company move on and stop this reliance on failed regulators to more regulation. I think it's just an unhelpful direction.
Well, maybe I can open that up to the panelists very briefly. I wish we did have more time and that we were running out of time. But basically what I think is being posited is the validity of the market failure model or not. So one's not necessarily talking about the failure of a particular individual business model. I think that point's well made and well taken. But the right that one's talking about is people's right to know. And if one can't find a commercial way in which, and entrepreneurs are not stepping up for people's right to know, what does one look to for that solution? We in Africa, like in America, like in Britain, like in so many countries in the world, keep on hoping and wishing for better government. But certainly where you have the market failures that we are seeing over and over again, venerable organizations that have been running for 100 years. I am the chair of a paper that we've been trying out for 10 years, Grocot's Mail, the oldest paper in South Africa. Every kind of innovation, every kind of cost cutting. We now cut our costs by 90%, but we cannot compete with Facebook and Google. So who do we look to for help? We must innovate out of that. I don't know how you innovate out of that. I don't know how you get your entrepreneur. We've tried everything. The only thing that's working at the moment is donor funding. And government's got the money, but it's not coming to our help. But it will spend $10 million, 10 million rand, a billion rand last year, another 5 billion rand this year, bailing out SAA, the biggest basket case in the history of aviation, and certainly a national embarrassment. But it can't help community radio and community media that allow people to know what's happening at the local council. That's the issue that we're looking at. So I don't want to throw out the policy solutions with the bathwater, and I don't want to use policy solutions, and I don't think any of the panel do, as a panacea for a lack of innovation. But that's just me. Panel, just maybe one comment. comment each, about a minute each. And I know, Francis, we're going to miss our tea.
Maybe just a quick one about the question of focusing on journalism. I don't think I was saying that we should abandon the thought of thinking about a commercial model that would facilitate the continuity of the media houses. And in the case of Kenya, there's a lot of conversation that's going on in the media houses. I think the initiatives about the local broadcasting, about betting, about opinion polls, as funding, as sources of revenue, are part of those initiatives that are taking place within the media houses. So that's going on. I think my point is that we should not so much focus from the journalistic point of view on revenue that we let die the other side of keeping the storytelling alive. I mean, the two should go together. But the journalists to try to focus a lot on this and see how the administrative side can also focus on that, but bring on the business entrepreneurs in creativity and new thinking in terms of how we can be able to package the content that the journalist is putting together for the market on whichever platform that plays on, that would be fine.
Yeah, so, I mean, I focus on the challenges because in 15 minutes, there's just so much time that one has. What we know, though, is that the commercial media sector is struggling. We know that when countries reach a particular level of development, we get this measure of cannibalization, and as certain markets start to integrate digital media ICTs more into their lifestyles, and this is impacting on traditional media and the kind of journalisms that the traditional media does and the things that the traditional media thinks are important. I think that additional thought needs to be put into the formats that we use for revenue generation. We know that donor funding is also sustainable. My belief is still that we need to try to sort out the underpinning fundamentals. That's a political issue, and that we still need to advocate for it. My big problem is that the organizations that used to just are weak or don't exist anymore, who's doing that, and what the consequences are going to be as a consequence. But I do also think that we need to look at other alternatives for revenue generation. One which I think I was talking with Bilal mentioned this morning, which is kind of like a community, like a community trust, that actually owns or runs newspapers. I suppose something like The Guardian, but he was talking about the Swedish model. He's the guy who knows more over there. He also has a session later on in the afternoon, so you can see that.
Well, I work for an organization that runs a program precisely because we recognize that it's not actually possible always to do the important journalism entirely on a commercial basis. But I think that we also have to ask media to take a realistic look at themselves. And all too often we talk to organizations and money is the problem, money is the problem. Then you say, who's your audience? They say the general public. I mean, that's just not realistic anymore. So knowing your audience, building those relationships, that's where a lot of work has to happen. And then we can look at ways, and perhaps those media, as this gentleman said, will start finding solutions to your own problems in your own contexts by actually taking a very hard look at what you're trying to do, and more importantly, listening to what people need and meeting that need. People pay for those needs to be met if they can, and otherwise there might be other businesses, and we think about ways to cross-subsidize. There's no reason not to run a viable coffee shop next door if you can and subsidize your newspaper, but we have to be thinking much more creatively.
I mean, I think media companies need to innovate, fail quickly and move on and try other new things. That has been the format that we have used in media. We remain profitable, but when we look at what will happen over the next few years, we need some solution, policy solution, because what had happened in terms of creating this one dominant player in the pay TV is that government has colluded with that company, so that there are no other licenses. We need that license because we believe that the next way forward is to be encryption and selling premium content to sponsor the content that you will provide for general public. We need to differentiate between the set of audience that we're broadcasting to. We know that we do broadcast to higher LSM by virtue of us being an English language station, but we do know that there is a whole lot of an inspirational audience that is out there that is lower LSM. They still depend on brands like food brands, which still needs to advertise on those platforms. We need to come up with new ways of attracting those advertisers. The big thing currently that is happening, because advertisers know their power, they are asking for content marketing. And to date, no one has a really clear strategy of how to combine the need of that stakeholder, which is an advertiser, with the need of your viewers. And we've been caught in situation where, you know, the viewers will tell you that that's not your editorial, that's not your style, you are not being hard on this piece. So there's a lot of that innovation that is taking place, and there's a lot of trial and error. And I think what also combined our situation, particularly in South Africa, is that if you see the presentation that was done by Professor Dagmo, is that 90% of South Africans still consume their entertainment via traditional television. That we talk of this 10% that is, yes, high LSM, that is attractive to advertisers, that have migrated to online platform, but it doesn't make financial sense to put all your resources for that 10%, because that 10% already, banking companies have now started to open up their media section where they target those people themselves. So there's a lot of like initiatives on trying to how to capture that audience, but at the same time, remembering that we must also be disruptors. We cannot allow advertisers or tech giants to be disruptors. We must also disrupt because we still have a very powerful product that the 92% of the nation depends on.
Thank you, everybody. A fascinating discussion, and I'm very glad that some of the fault lines and tensions emerged. It is very much a question, not so much of how this top 10% or the 15%, particularly in the African continent, but it's as true in the developed countries, how they are served, but really a question of how people get the news and the journalism that they need at the other end of the provision. And that's the challenge which is taking place across the globe. And I think we need to think about both market and non-market solutions to that, about innovations in both those spaces, because non-market solutions create dependencies. So they all come with their own downsides, and market solutions don't often work for the poorest sections of our population. But let's go and have some coffee, let's go and have some caffeine, let's have some tea. Thank you very much for your attendance and your attention.
Thank you. Well done. But I'm sure you did a good job. Yes, I think we met you earlier. Okay, just look at a few things. Take this guy.
1 minute. Lucy, yeah. 45 minutes late. What is going on in this place? They didn't have a chair in the first session. The second session got it back to time and then lost the plot.
That's what I wanted to check. What do we do? How many minutes each?
Well, we were planning on a 90-minute session. What was the arrangement? Because I was
right. So I think we are likely to have 1 hour instead of
even an hour.
Yes.
We can get away with an hour.
We can get away with an hour, right?
We'll come back on time.
Yeah.
Right. So, for me, what is the story now? Are you going to run the?
Just that you guys go first. Come on. Discussion.
Oh, all right.
Well, thanks for giving us insights into that.
Okay, so where's the technician?
No, he said what happened with the first one, the previous session, was there for us.
Yeah, he didn't qualify. And that one is dramatic. He couldn't So I guess we should pass first. Huh?
Yeah, to your left.
Not so bad. Just we would like to make some photos because during the presentation we will not have the ability. We make before and we say now without the view of people because it's sort of a break. That's a good one. So when we can.
And here, Prof.
Yeah, we met each other.
We met each other. Okay.
We need to discuss. So, yes, we met. Yes, right.
So that's why I like to get a photo with it.
Sorry?
That's why I like to get a photo.
We like with my
just to confirm,
yes, we make a presentation somehow.
Yes,
Yes, so I'm
So what I think we can do now because
Δηλαδή να κάνουμε πως μιλάμε.
I think
Εγώ θα μιλάω στη μέση δεξιά-αριστερά που σημαίνει, μετά θα δούμε ο Κυριάκος και μετά εσύ θα βγάλουμε τρεις και θα σε ανεβάσουμε πριν την παρουσίαση.
In the next 5 minutes, you can, just come, don't give the, no, we have to go back now. Before you are running with the thing, I mean, sorry, but can you return?
Absolutely.
Just get
Otherwise, we will eat into the lunch.
Exactly. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Okay.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. Ναι, ναι, και ήρθες εγώ. We need to verify your vest that we are here.
Okay, all right. Just be put this side. Okay.
Ελάτε. Ναι, έτσι εδώ. Ναι, και εσύ εδώ. Κάντε τους μιλάμε. Ναι, ναι. Και τώρα φαίνεται σαν φωτογραφία, καθίστε έτσι. Ναι, ναι. Κοιτάζουμε το κοινό. Μην είμαστε τόσο κοντά, γιατί φαίνεται. Κάτσε εδώ εσύ. Εσύ εδώ, ωραία. Excellent. Δεν είμαστε έτσι.
Let's get this thing ready to go.
Thank you. And one more, please. Yes, My PhD student, he's doing that way. Thank you. And one more with the young lady.
Lady in front, yes.
This is fine, sir. This is based off that table that you had for your first paper.
Yes, but did you add the table that you drew up the paper included?
That's the table. That's the only table.
Thank you very much.
Oh,
Thank
right.
you.
Where is it? Is it on the...
Yeah, that's it.
We are the Greek team.
Good, good. I like it.
Thank you very much. Ναι, ναι. Μα έχει και πίτσες, πάμε να φάμε πίτσες.
I don't know. Oh, nobody's going to be here. Right, can we make sure it's So as long as we connect the first frame is up, UK's in the show that it's efficient.
Makes me look bad because how we covering how we looks like this means that makes me know what. I'm here first to make sure I implement data and to educate.
I mean, how come we've lost an hour since 8:30.
People that came in around about quarter past 8, when they get in the room, they started chatting.
We lost an hour in 8:30, 9:17. We lost an hour in less than 2 hours.
Organize I came in around the first second presentation. So that's the project.
The last conference I did to one of our voting first.
No issues is to the
senior people here. So what are you doing now?
I'm transferring the process to the USB.
Is there any videos?
No.
Big conference is there. Yes. So this is.
First was number 1, yeah. After it's number 2,
Well, I need to use the data to prepare.
Thank you. So let's double check. Before we officially say it's done.
So the first one is what I need to highlight. Okay, just show the first one, please. Coming down. Okay. Okay. Fine. Okay, that's how it looks. Okay, need to click up to see. Forward, forward. So that's the first question.
Testing, 1, 2, testing.
So stand up straight and flexible.
Hello.
Thank you. Cheers.
So you can I used to. My wife was. But we had a, in fact, in the 90s, it was a very close relationship with Primary Bank. My wife and I were running it. Was,
yeah, Steve been there for 25 years, so then he was.
Okay, hang on. So this, here's your time range. So then that can give you. So now how many did you take? Thank you. No, I don't think it was on Facebook. I can't see the heading. So I have to.
When they can send people like they want to organize or maybe a month or share this. But the problem is for me. But all that is not. But then making it. So he was sending him another thing. He was saying that that I applied to and I felt like instead they would transform it thank you.
Right. We will be starting this session shortly, and I have an eminent panel that will consider the topic peripheral capital goes global, NASPAS, Tencent, and BRICS countries. And I think it's an important topic, not least because NASPAS is based in Cape Town. We've been reading reports in March that Naspers is trading at 30% discount to the value of stake in China's biggest internet company, Tencent. What is the meaning of this? Can we look at Naspers and Tencent as vehicles of cultural production? Could we, to paraphrase Murdoch and Holding, examine not only the base of control, but also the general economic context within which the control is exercised? And to begin to answer some of those questions, I have, as I said, an eminent panel all the way from the University of KwaZulu-Natal, Mpumelelo Dludla, who is an MA student at the Center for Communication and Media and Society, and whose thesis is in fact titled Hustle and Flow, an analysis of Naspers operationalization as reported by a prominent South African newspaper publication over a 3-year period. And then there is also Professor Ruth Tia Thomasel, a professor at the Center for Communication, Media and Society, KZN. She also holds the UNESCO Chair in Communication for South Africa. And then there is Kian G. Thomasel as well, a distinguished professor, Faculty of Humanities, University of Joburg. Without much ado, I'd like to call upon Prof. Ruth Tia Thomasel.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the audience to be with us on today. I can just say at tea time yesterday that Naspers has just sold one of its subsidiaries in India, Flipkart, and they did very nicely out of that. What's interesting about Naspers is that it is a predominantly South African company, and what we would like to show is the way that the South African company has moved internationally. And has, it's in Diatis's words, it's a perfect example of a kind of economic counterflow. And also, with what we'd like to illustrate in this discussion here is the way in which it has jumped platforms over time. So this is a not really an historical study, but it just takes a position over a 3-year period from the data that we have collected over this 3-year period. You'll be glad to know that Kumi is no longer a student, a master's student. He is a master's graduate, and he did very nicely, thank you. So now he is a doctoral student, and that's much more important than being a master's student. It's also much longer. So this is what we're going to do today. This has been a very collaborative effort between the three of us, and it's going to be followed immediately. Kumi is going to take us through the more South African aspect of this. So I will focus on the internationalization, and in the next part, Kumi will focus on South Africa. So let's just, for those of you who are not acquainted with Naspers, this is just a brief background. Some of it is a bit historical. And it's a huge company with a very, very large holding of money. In 2016, it was valued at 64 billion $64 billion. And it operates in 120 countries, many of which are referred to as emerging markets. As I said, it's a very good example of counterflow, of movement of information, media content, consumer goods, and capital from the so-called developing world into the more developed market. And in this study, we want to point out how Naspers has diversified its core media holdings, both print and television, what we refer to as its heritage media, into digital information services providers and e-commerce, and how it has done this both globally and domestically, and how this diversification has allowed it to maintain its preeminent position in the media market in South Africa. And much of the money that Naspers makes in its new online, and I say new in inverted commas because every year it's less new, in its online sphere, it plows back into its heritage market, so it has not lost its heritage market at all. So Naspers owns satellite televisions in more than 50 countries throughout Africa and adjacent territories. And it also has a number of digitally based interventions. Some of the ones that you may know are Movil in Brazil, Avito in Russia, Redbus in India, and Flipkart, which, as I said, is they have just sold, and of course the notorious Tencent in China, of which they own 34%. So if you can look at what they owned in the 1980s, which was the kind of heyday of their operation as an apartheid, as a prop-up of the apartheid state, and this was their holdings, media platforms for magazines, newspapers, television, and then they moved on to, in the next phase, to acquire the internet minority shareholders of Tencent and Mail RU, which in Russia, we were in Russia just recently, Kian and myself, and nobody in Russia was aware that their largest social media platform was actually partly South African owned. They also work in online retail delivery services, online messaging, online retailers and e-tailers, travel services, social media, and video streaming. So you can see this is a very large movement away from the more traditional media of print and television. Their paid platform, their paid television platform is based around MultiChoice, which includes a number of different sub-brands. And GoTV is an African-oriented platform that was not operational in South Africa until very recently, and it has now moved over to South Africa. And that's kind of interesting because if you talk about technology, some of the technological aspects that have been introduced by NASPERS have been introduced elsewhere and then brought back into South Africa. So it's not as if they start everything in South Africa and move out. It's not a dispersal model, but in fact quite a fractured model where it is in and out. And there are reasons for that that maybe we could bring up if we had time later in the discussion. Now, we've taken a political economy approach to the study with overlapping spheres of the political economy approach with the economics, politics and regulation, culture, content and representation, and technology that all come together, that they all have their own sphere of influence, but at some stage they all intervene and knock onto each other. So put differently, economics is about value, dividends, profits, market share, investment, growth potential. And this is just a little sideline in Pumi's thesis, for instance, where he examined the way in which newspapers, financial newspapers reported on NASPERS. The majority of the reports on NASPERS actually had to do with the share price. So they were all about dividends, profits and market share, and they were not really concerned with any of the other issues. In technology, we have print, broadcasting, and digital internet, and all three of those spheres are very heavily colonized by NASPERS. In terms of politics and regulation, they take cognizance of both national regulations as well as global regulations, and that complicates their lives quite significantly, but the way in which they have dealt with is something that we are also going to be discussing, and how they keep the kind of the global is almost secondary to the national. So they are global in a sense that they are all over the place, and they are national in the sense that each of their enterprises is deeply embedded in the country in which it is located. Content is really important, and I think that this is something when we talk about technology and money, we often forget about content. And what we want to point out is that the ideological content of NASPERS has never been forgotten, even though they are selling commodities now, and the commoditization is a major thrust that we're going to be emphasizing. Is still the underlying issue of the ideological content of nationalist and sectarian commerce, and this is available and evident in both the commercial as well as in their entertainment products. So I'm not going to talk too much about the history of NASPERS because it is really too difficult to fit it into the now shortened time that we have. Just to say that it started off as a nationalist party vehicle in 1915. It acquired, and over a period of time, it acquired and cannibalized most of the Afrikaans press over time, and it was a very important part of the pushback of the reformist, so-called reformist pushback in the 1980s, so that it really has been very implicated in South African politics for many, many years, and there are a good deal of studies on this, and many of them are extremely worthwhile studies. If you're looking for something, I would suggest you start with Gabriel Botma, who, in my opinion, is probably the best chronicler of Naspers' historical past. So Naspers is a transformative country, and this is a quote from the all-seeing Koos Becker, who is now the sort of the leader emeritus of Naspers. He says that they've captured the trend sort of evolving in e-commerce and how we consume media. It's very hard to forecast what Naspers is going to look like in 5 years' time. This was written 3 years ago. But you can use your imagination to think how they will grow along with the e-commerce market. And that was 3 years ago. It's very prescient because, in fact, that's exactly what has happened. So what do they own? So this is the role of media companies, as we know, and as this conference has emphasized again and again, is becoming more diffuse. It's as much about platform as about content. And their model, the Naspers model, is to buy into a company that has around about 50 to 200 employees, small companies, very often really established, 3 to 4 years on, that are making headway but are not yet profitable. Naspers does not do startups. They do not pick up companies. They do not create companies on their own. They kind of look around and see what's working, and then they gobble it. And for every 4 they buy, they spit out 3. So a lot of what you're going to be hearing about is their meteoric rise. What you're not going to be hearing about, which is a different paper altogether, is the numbers of pebbles that they throw along the roadside. So in the 2015 financial year, they returned a 6 billion loss on their e-commerce. That's 14% higher, and they just keep going. So their financial model is that advertising becomes content, something that Kumi will expand on later in his paper, and it's all about sales. It's all about the content becomes less and less important on the e-commerce. It's really about commodification, so the commodities become content. This is where they are spread across the world, so if you are in any doubt as to whether they are a global company, in fact they are. What is really interesting is that if you look at the United States, you will see that it is Naspers free. That is not entirely true. They have one company in California. That company is an acquisition company. It buys up television series, television content for its distribution across the multi-choice network. But you will notice that there is practically nothing in Europe and practically nothing in America. So when they talk about emerging markets, they really mean the rest of the world. So their scope of activities are in broadcast, print, and intermedia. And lucratively, their most lucrative and notorious holdings are their holdings in Tencent in China and the Russian internet mail RU. I just want to take 2 seconds to look at this. This comes from their structure, which is no longer on their website, but was on their website until about a year ago. And what you can see in your top right-hand corner is their broadcast stuff, and a tiny little bit on print media. Now, when you consider that up until the late 80s, in 1986, when they had one channel, one digital subscription channel, they were all print. This is quite an amazing difference. Look at the huge volume that they have on their internet and e-commerce sites. So they're extremely profitable. They just keep going up. And every time you read the newspaper, it says, is it too late to buy 10-cent shares? Is it too late to buy Naspers shares? And next month it will say, is it too late to buy Naspers shares? Because in fact, they're still going up. Their profitability by section and by sector, I'm going to just skip through this in the interest of time, and their shareholding. You can see that their shareholding is still largely South African. And although they don't operate in the United States, a good proportion of their shareholding is in America. The rest is in Europe and very, very little in Asia. So this is almost a direct contradiction to where they actually operate. so that the investment comes from the developed countries, their holdings come from the emerging countries. The print media, we're not going to have time to do this, but they are ubiquitous. And what's interesting about their print media is that there is a very strong vertical integration. They own everything from Timber 24, which grows trees, through to the pulp producing stage, through to printing, to publication of newspapers and media. Many of those newspapers historically have been in Afrikaans. Those Afrikaans titles still exist. They have expanded in the 1980s and 1990s into the so-called tabloid press, and incorporated Afrikaans speakers of all colors and all races and all classes, so that Afrikaans still becomes a very important ideological interest in their repertoire, but they also produce newspapers and magazines in the English language. There's a great deal of horizontal integration in their print as well as their vertical integration. And that's their domain, in their digital domain in South Africa, which is extremely large. So broadcasting, and I really want to take this very, very quickly, they were really the first broadcasters in South Africa to break the monopoly of the South African Broadcasting Corporation. And that in itself is an important story of how they were able to buy out their partners, their English language print partners, who really didn't have the appetite to move onto a platform that just seemed not to make a lot of money, which I'm sure that they could kick themselves for now. And so again, that speaks very much to the theme of this conference about the way in which technology and the kind of future visualization of where technology is taking us is often overlooked by companies that can't see beyond the immediacy. There's still strong, vibrant growth in South Africa, although you can see from the earlier diagram that their broadcast media has shrunk in proportion to their online media, but it is still very important and it is still turning over a profit. And the other point to really remember about their broadcast media is it was the war chest. It was the money from which they were able to move into the online domain. If they hadn't have had that money, they would not have been able to move out of it. So both broadcasting remained central to their activities, and it was also the genesis from which they were able to move beyond that. Their scope of broadcasting is mainly in Africa. They were right through the Middle East and into Greece, but that has now diminished considerably, and they pulled back a great deal. One thing that Naspers is not scared about doing is making a loss. If they make a loss, they just shrug their shoulders, pull back, and start somewhere else. Multi-choice is really important. As I said, broadcasting, I'm just rushing through this because I think the good stuff is at the end. I do want to make a point about the centrality of sport. Why Naspers has managed to maintain, or multi-choice rather, has managed to maintain its preeminence in the broadcast sphere is largely to do with sport. They don't have much in the way of news. Their news is really syndicated news. They buy in channels, BBC, ITV, CNN, the usual kind of suspects of international broadcast channels, but they don't have their own dedicated 24-hour channel. They also provide a platform for the South African broadcasters, the free-to-air broadcasters who want to get into the digital domain. And in the absence of a digital terrestrial plan ever coming to fruition in South Africa, they provide the only digital platform that South African broadcasters, free-to-air broadcasters, are able to get hold of. So, now the question becomes: are they broadcasters, or are they video entertainment? And this question is actually a question that arises from their own strategic thinking. They no longer refer to themselves as broadcasters. They don't have a broadcast division. They only have a video entertainment division. And again, this speaks to the dominance of the way in which entertainment per se has taken over the notion of broadcasting, and has really permeated the notion of broadcasting broadcasting, where even news channels become entertainment. And convergence has had a lot to do with this, and the delivery of the way they've been able to deliver their entertainment across very many different channels. Now, the threat of new technology, that new technology allows for great ability to expand, but it is also a threat in many ways. It's something that has to be managed. And perhaps the biggest management threat is streaming. They really were caught on the back foot because before they realized that Netflix was in South Africa, before they had a streaming platform. And I'm not going to deal with that too much because I think we will deal with that more in the next paper. But it's an interesting way in which the threat of technology has given, or technology can work in two ways. So I'm going to leave all that Showmax stuff down and move on. Now, what happens when your historical core business begins to slow down? And there's a lot of talk now about the way in which newspapers are finding themselves in, shall we say, challenging times, where traditional broadcasters are up against very, very tight margins. So what do? You move to the internet. And Naspers was one of the first companies to really understand the necessity of moving to the internet, while still at the same time maintaining its historical focus, or its focus on historical heritage broadcast. So we talk about its internet empire, classifieds, e-tailing, marketplaces, and you can see in the next picture, which is a show and tell, where they are and where their big companies are and how they spread across them. And it's not only that they spread across different companies, but they're also spread across different kinds of platforms. And this is some of the acquisitions that they have taken on. And I've mentioned Mail.ru before. Tencent, of course, is the biggest. And the next platform, Tencent, by the way, I think what I really should mention was they made their money on the back of WeChat, which they called Weixin in Chinese. It's basically a mobile app, and it never really took off very much in South Africa. If you have if you have a WhatsApp, you'll understand exactly how it works. But it has many value-added add-ons to it as well. So this is Tencent up to July 2012, and you can see it's growing, and it's been growing ever since. Now, of course, the problem with that is an over-reliance on a single entity, which makes them extremely vulnerable. And this is when the marketplaces, they say as if the marketplace were an entity that actually had life of its own, gets very jittery, is the over-reliance on a single entity and what they're going to do about it. And the other problem that they really have to face is the volatility of emerging markets. Because if you work in emerging markets, you work at very high profit margins, but you also work in a country where regulation is kind of iffy, and where banking is difficult, and there's a sensitivity of volatility, particularly in China. So what happens when e-commerce flattens out? So there's a great deal of vagrancy in this, and sometimes you withdraw and sometimes you move into other areas. We want to talk a little bit about collaborative globalization and the way in which companies cross-pollinate or work within synergy of each other. And in fact, when we decided to do this, we found that in fact it was actually more difficult to find examples than not. So we have listed a few examples there, but what's really interesting is the relative lack of synergy between the companies and how they are relatively inured from one another. And diversification and mergers, there are fewer and fewer companies. While the Naspers tends to diversify across different platforms and into different areas, at the same time it tends to merge companies within those areas so that they have fewer, stronger companies that are able to provide greater logistical support to their customers. So what is being distributed? So we have all the stuff, and what was the content that is actually being broadcast. So in fact, there is a lot of new diversity that has been introduced. There's, for instance, in South Africa, we have a lot of Bollywood. We have South African content and drama that's been sold throughout Africa. We have material that comes direct from the USA, but that you can see within hours of broadcast. So it has changed quite substantially, but there is still a huge reliance, almost over-reliance on material from the developed markets. So you're moving into the emerging markets, but you're selling stuff that is largely, at least in the broadcasting field, largely sourced from the developed markets. And that again, you see the contradiction that you saw in the investment of that kind of inversion. And online content is the same. For instance, if you look at Tencent, what do they broadcast? They broadcast 20th Century Fox, Fox Sports, National Geographic, Sony Music Corporation, Warner Brothers, Time Warner, HBO, and US National Football. So it is in many ways the globalization that we all fear, the dominance of the kind of hegemonic West is very much evident in the content, even in the emerging markets. It does include some South Korean, but it's not the same. And the pattern here is very similar to the competitors such as Alibaba, for instance, which has more or less the same offerings. So just to finalize in the last few minutes that I have, themes that we would really like to emphasize is the transition of the traditional media houses from heritage media, particularly into the online and internet platforms, the expansion globally into emerging markets, and including some of BRICS countries, the acquisitions in e-commerce, and the financial cross-subsidization between countries and markets, where money that is generated in one country will be used for acquisitions of companies in another. So the media moves from issues of news, political and ideologically dense, to entertainment and commerce. So this is kind of contradictory. There's both at one level an homogenization as well as a diversification of content, but very contradictory. There's a greater emphasis on syndication and globalization of news, which again adds to the loss of diversity of news that we experience in many other areas of media concentration. And I'm going to stop there.
Thanks, Prof. I'll call Mpumelelo Dludla to continue the NASPAS story.
Good morning, everyone. How are you all doing? I hope you're feeling all right and relaxed. Continuing from Prof. Ruth's said, I would like to discuss Tencent, the collection of Kate Perry, Britney Spears, and all the other US celebrities, but unfortunately I got tasked to look at more of the South African traditional aspect of NASPAS's organization. And the paper that we're looking to is Removing the Middleman, an investigation into NASPAS's diverse business platforms over a three-year period, as reported by South African financial newspapers. NASPAS is a global internet and entertainment multinational corporation that has also become a major technological investor. And if you continue to what Prof. Tomitili said when she focused on an aspect of television, NASPAS in the last couple of years have moved away from considering themselves a broadcaster, which is fascinating.
that you look at a company that was once a print company that shifted to broadcasting. Now they exclusively look at themselves as an internet and entertainment company. More so, they also look at themselves as a technological investor. That's in the early 2000s when Naspers is beginning its diversification engine. And also a far cry from its early beginnings as an ideological powerhouse for Afrikaner cultural movement. What we're discussing there is, if you look at its inception, Naspers was a regional-based company when it started off as a publisher, based in Cape Town, in Cape Town in the 1915s. That officially grew through various mergers, startups, and acquisition into the dominant national-based media powerhouse. But even from that, it's going furthermore. More so that if you look at its content, which was predominantly Afrikaner culture based, there was also some little, I would say, contradiction in the sense that the regional aspect of where Naspers was based in Cape Town was constantly clashed with the more conservative aspect of Afrikaner nationalism in the Transport area in the early 1950s to the 1970s, but no, 1960s to the 1960s. However, when it got to a certain aspect, it eventually became this national powerhouse, and both sides collaborated into a common view of how things should go, how the ideological movement should proceed afterwards. And when the advent of democracy in South Africa came about and accessibility to the global market came through, that's when Naspers officially blew up. How they did that was fascinating in the sense that they manipulated their way into somehow, how do I put the manipulated their way into keeping its core businesses through various measures with PE companies, but yet selling off their less than profitable companies to the other PE companies as well, which is I find very fascinating that you're allowed to do that. I mean, Anton Harber basically said it in one of his articles that other white liberal English press companies basically got purged completely at Naspers because their content was traditionally Afrikaner based, was relatively left alone. As I've really discussed, that Naspers has shared its historical past and elements and version into its business ethos. So in terms of unpacking that, it's once its global access came into fruition, Naspers in a sense lost itself in its pursuit of profits over its ideological roots to such an extent that the company had to look within themselves and stop and realize that no, we are getting lost in our way our business is operating. We need to reflect on what we're doing. Do we want to lose our identity as who we are, for our identity as an Afrikaans-based company, a traditional identity as an Afrikaans-based company, or do we want to care about its profits making and generating income? So the company decided, as Prof would explain upon, decided not to abandon its heritage, decided to keep its ideological roots, but not abandon its heritage media, traditional heritage media platforms. So that is why you see them still hanging on to the newspaper, the print businesses. That is why you still see them consolidating their broadcast. I think it's that ideological base that they'd like to still keep remaining and keep as part of their core of who they are. Now, Naspers are a commercial media company with a stable of diverse business companies, where the internet, media-based and video entertainment-based companies. And in this presentation, we only concentrated only on Naspers' it's South African holdings, not the international. As you can see, this is their platform as of 2017. Look how much the internet platform has expanded compared to the previous picture Prof Ruth has shown, and yet you can still see that the heritage-based platforms, video, which is now video entertainment, and print digital pigments are still there. They're still consolidating and in certain aspects expanding upon them. In the commercial and digital age, Naspers' production and distribution of content underwent significant changes as well. What happened is advertisements became the primary content on display and in Naspers' various media platforms, especially the advent of online retail and online services. Essentially what's happened is Naspers started to focus more on online classifieds, and what it did was it circumvented what we called advertisement agencies and businesses, and basically decided to sell those, transform those adverts into content to disseminate on their own online platforms. That's why they require various online retail, online marketplaces, online comparative sites. And this has placed an emphasis on Naspers having greater influence in the specialized area of distribution of online retail and services sold. Naspers indicated the performance of its online content had decreased its trading losses and increased its trading profits as it gained traction across various platforms. And Naspers emphasized the relevance of company placed on its online content in relation to its e-commerce businesses gaining and consolidating market share through acquisitions, mergers, and key emerging markets. Excuse me, I'm just collecting my thoughts. Thank you. Essentially, Naspers' transition to online media content, online e-commerce platforms had increased their profits. They were not reliant on their video broadcasting or video entertainment or broadcasting business and print. They find a different avenue to which to garner more profits for their company, for themselves, as well as look at different avenues to expand their businesses, not only in South Africa, but as well as internationally, which Prof. Ruth expanded upon. Scholars have published numerous articles on Naspers' attempt to draw in consumers to the various print and pay television platforms and from its inception to the late 2000s. And there have been very good, I would say, dissertations written by international academic scholars and South African scholars, and various articles written by Herman Wasserman, Gabriel Botman, and even Guy Berger, looking into the aspect of Naspers' diversification and drawn diversification into online, or what traditional, what you could say, it's online platform. But there's still limited knowledge of the methods and how it's drawing in consumers towards its digital platforms, and I think that's where the paper focuses on. Not much articles or not much research has looked into that aspect. I know this, Dietitian has written exclusively about Tencent, which is a Naspers-owned company, but not really emphasis has been looked at in Naspers in certain aspects. I would say that most of the traditional research or articles written or papers are more on the historical aspect. It's as if the e-commerce aspect in itself has been forgotten or just lost, or it's just maybe the Jedi mind trick us into not looking at it at all. So this presentation seeks to explore the following aspects of Naspers' media platforms. How has Naspers' advertisement-oriented online content been able to circumvent the middleman, in this case advertisement agencies, and sell directly to consumers? And secondly, how has Naspers' stable of media platforms been able to entice consumers, advertisement agencies to their respective platforms, online retail and services locally? The globe, I forgot to talk about the globe, it's a local aspect. So here the thing we're looking into is the political tone of communication. We're looking to aspects of commodification, specialization, and structuration. Forgive me, but due to loss of time, due to time constraints, I'll be just breezing through this, and as well as the methodology, which is basically we used archival newspapers from the four prominent newspapers, which was Business Day Live, Fin 24, MoneyWeb, and Financial Mail. And we looked at them from a period of the 1st of June 2013 to June 2016. And we used automatic analysis for the paper. And what we find for the results was Naspers established themselves as one of the premier online e-commerce companies in South Africa, to such an extent that they were listed as one of the top 10 visited websites in South Africa in 2014. More so, it was able to consolidate its local e-commerce businesses by cannibalizing its smaller operating businesses when they realized that they were not making profits, and they realized that it's better to garner everything that it's better to distribute, not distribute, focus all their energy into one core online retail business, and that in that sense was Kalahari.com. With regards to Media with regards to Media 24, what is interesting is Media 24 was traditionally a digitally based company what Now Space decided to do was also restructure that company and include that as part of their e-commerce structure. So that's why if you look at Media 24 right now, it's not only a digital publishing company, it's also an e-commerce division of Now Space. Now Space also expanded into the mobile markets. The company looked into the mobile market in the sense of, since the dynamic nature of e-commerce market has seen the rise of mobile users operating in the e-commerce markets. What Now Space realized is that more people were accessing the internet using mobile devices, and they realized there was a market they could enter into that. There's a market in which they could enter there and establish themselves as a premier company. And then from there, as Prof discussed, was Showmax. And now Showmax, when it first was launched, it was a new media concept in South Africa. It was a subscription, video, and on-demand based platform that had issues when it was launched. As the esteemed guest yesterday, Mr. Harry Duckmore stated that South Africa still has an issue of data usage, so that played on that issue. It caused problems when it was launched. And its internet infrastructure in South Africa is not as advanced in European countries. So Now Space's SVOD had an issue when it first launched, but Now Space was determined to establish the platform. It tried to expand the platform over into 3 continents, and it was Europe, North America, and Australasia. And what they tried to do is, by expanding that, they wanted to also expand Afrikaans content as well as West African content into that. But the issue is that the regional rights that they probably had in South Africa would still have that issue of having those regional rights in those platforms. So that might have been an issue as well in the expansion. My apologies, the previous slide is a bit push on. Now Space is predominantly a print media division and there structural changes, but we discussed this. My apologies. Let's talk about Netflix, because I think that's the more important, I believe that's one of the most important aspects. And that is when Netflix decided to expand its business operations into South Africa, were not worried or concerned. They actually welcomed the challenge to have Netflix come. They brought them out and said, no, fine, we're happy to have you come here. You diversify the broadcasting rights for most of the consumers, and we welcome it. So what Now Space, as you can see from them, what they also, however, to combat this challenge, what Now Space decided to do was improve the services of its state paid television subsidiary, DSTV, by including the added value service Catch Up. And they also had confidence in its strong sports content that will be able to withhold whatever challenge that Netflix could bring. However, Now Space did eventually launch its own SOVD called Showmax in 2015. And what Showmax's advantage over Now Space was that it had acquired the regional rights to stream most of the top preeminent content overseas, as well as what Showmax also did was they partnered up with Telkom at the time, and they had a cheaper subscription base compared to Netflix, which we'll back up on. Their partnership with Telkom, so the Telkom users be able to stream Showmax content for free, and which was ideal for Telkom, because Telkom was also looking into penetrating the video on demand markets as a new revenue stream for their value-added services. And while they were looking into that, because Telkom themselves were also trying to monetize their R1 billion fiber optic cable infrastructure. But Telkom saw this as an opportunity to also expand themselves, their business platforms, and also penetrate into a new market. Now, the fascinating thing is, as of 2 years ago, 2 years ago from my profit, Telkom decided to basically sever their partnership with Showmax and decided to open themselves up to all other streaming services, which is interesting. Now, the content that Showmax hold, as we discussed, was over 20 episodes of television series and episodes. But if you look at their subscription package, it's very interesting. Showmax decided to, preface their their packaging saying that they cost less than what Netflix would offer with their 100 or 99 rand per month package compared to Netflix's lowest package service of $7.8 per month, excluding data, which is very fascinating because if you had to convert both packages, they kind of end up similar. But yet, the interesting thing is the pricing of Showmax is less compared to what Netflix is at its most premium. I think that's the interesting part. Even though both companies are relatively low and starting to earn their price packages, if one to increase the Netflix package, you'd see that Netflix is eventually will be more expensive, and that's what Naspers were banking on. In regards to the online retail, the issue with online retail when Naspers started was that it was a very relatively underdeveloped market. It suffered from poorly brick and mortar. It was relatively underdeveloped because of competing with traditional brick and mortar companies, as well as foreign companies such as Amazon and Apple, who operate in South Africa, as our esteemed guest, Mr. Douglas stated yesterday, is they didn't pay tax. Sorry, I'm rushing out of time. Just want to discuss Kalahari and Takealot. So what happened was Naspers decided to merge its online retail company, Kalahari.com, with its rival company, Takealot, in order for them just to survive in the online retail market, because they were richly hemorrhaging losses, and they believed that the only way they consolidate and operate and survive in the market was to merge. Now, the interesting thing was when they merged, they also acquired Mr. Delivery, which is a food service company, and Superballet.com, which is an online retail and fashion company as well. Another platform that Naspers had operated, not really operated, but had, was they took WeChat, which was probably a platform from Tencent, and they tried to implement it here in South Africa, which was a great example of transnational synergy. And its new dimension to serve, and what Naspers tried to do with WeChat was they tried to add a new dimension to it in terms of, not really Naspers per se, WeChat Africa. What they tried to do was to add a new dimension to the service platform by adding third-party content, which was essentially brands posting their content on the platform and interacting with the WeChat subscribers. The essential aim of doing that was to make WeChat the central hub of Africa's additional content services. However, unfortunately, as Prof. said, WeChat did not take off, and it's still meddling. Now, if it comes to that, how has this come about? The question now comes back to the question is, how is the middleman being removed? In essence, Naspers' acquisition of online content companies has circumvented the need to deal with traditional advertising agencies, as well as social media platforms that made it possible for brands and consumers to interact with each other. If you look at the various WeChat platforms, you could look at the various online e-commerce companies, it's like, for instance, Takealot.com, as it's now called. There's no need for advertising agencies there for customers to deal directly with advertising agencies. Most of the interaction is from business to consumer based or consumer to consumer based. It does not mean that advertising has been discarded. Rather, it's still central to the profit-making business. It's just that for this instance, it has been disregarded. In this context, in South African Naspers platform, it has been disregarded. Now, how is Naspers enticed consumers and advertisers? What Naspers has decided to do, what Naspers did, Naspers media platform's ability to consolidate its business in their respective markets is how they were able to generate consumers and advertisers into their businesses. So the amount of the times that Naspers merged with their respective companies, the times that Naspers established dominance, that's when they've been able to entice consumers and advertisers towards their respective platforms. And it's very interesting that with their online content, they've squeezed out local and international competition, but in a sense that if you have country and you have bid or buy, who are two different models of operating in South Africa, but yet Naspers still has the premium online e-commerce business in Takealot.com. and NASPER's media platforms acquisition and incorporation of content and value-added services. Now, if you go back to basics, try and incorporate it with our theory, look at Vincent Moscow's 3 pillars of political economy of global media analysis, which is structuration, commodification, and specialization. You can see that the network structure and the transnational nature of NASPERS is very interesting. It's not your traditional media corporation in the sense that it acquires percentage of shareholding companies, as Prof. has discussed, but in the South African context, it's prepared to venture into different platforms in each different platforms and providing with each relative autonomous form from each other. More so than that, they retain their earlier emphasis of both horizontal and vertical integration in those platforms, which makes sense if you look at the traditional heritage platforms, which are fully integrated compared to the e-commerce platforms, which are relatively autonomous in themselves. NASPERS has no emphasis on how those companies operate and no emphasis on the virtual structure of those companies. In terms of commodification, everything else is for sale, but be careful with that. Everything's for sale for a price. NASPERS always has a price in what they're selling. More so, the goods and sales the selling goods and services have now become new content. Brands advertise directly to consumers, as we recently discussed, without intervention of third-party agencies, and the amortization of value-added services, the elusive goal of all online enterprises. Sometimes NASPERS has gotten that right with the investment in Tencent and with the investment supposedly with Plenary.com, but sometimes not, which is an issue with WeChat, and unfortunately became an issue with Plenary.com at that stage. But now Showmax's inclusion of the DSTV premium package globalized its content and is stratified by class and ability to pay. In terms of specialization, it's a more like Coco model. And what it means is each respective company that NASPERS owns is autonomous, as we've discussed, relatively runs for themselves. NASPERS has no direct say how they operate, and each company is treated as an entity within its own online world. With the greater integration, as we've discussed in heritage media, there's more cross-flow of content, and including selling of programs, like for instance here in South Africa, it's a Dingo, and the Commission of Africa-wide Programming, Big Brother Africa. So in conclusion, in opening this paper, we noted that NASPER's historical shift from ideology to profit, and this paper has attempted to outline some of these strategies of NASPERS to unlock value in the South African online market, and NASPERS remains the most profitable trading share on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, speaks to its ability to generate capital. Thank you very much, everyone.
Yeah, fascinating research on NASPERS. By the way, this is Mpumelelo Dlala's first presentation ever at a conference, so please give him a round. Right, I will now open this session for questions and comments. I think we'll have 5 minutes of that in the interest of time.
Thank you very much for that. That was absolutely fascinating. I just have a question for you about what do you think NASPERS, where does NASPERS find value in Media 24? In this whole, which was their starting the business. Why are they holding on to it? What do you think they're going to do?
Thanks for the presentation, fascinating. My question is related to the question that has just been asked. Is NASPERS not holding on to its own identity only because it's still profitable? Or it's just not losing money from it? If it were, it would abandon it altogether.
Thank you very much, Mpumelelo. And what I can say is that we're in good hands. with those two colleagues come from there as well. But I think for me, there are 2 points that I want to raise. The first one is that NASPER's success is also aided by grandfathering by policy, especially looking at South Africa. It's a very key issue because they never applied for a license. They got the one for Mnet, and then they were grandfathered into SABC platforms. I think Mr. Filmon can attest to that, where they grew up and became what they are. And even now, they are still being grandfathered. And because of the negotiated settlement of South Africa in transitional era, they were allowed to remain as they are. If you look at their ownership, actually is above the threshold of media ownership in South Africa. And because of that, they've been touched on that aspect. Then the last part as a recommendation is when you got a highly integrated company like that, which can cannibalize into whatever, the level of the rot is not easily picked up. And I want to say that maybe as you do your analysis, don't just focus on what the media are saying about this, because sometimes these journalists, I think a colleague said it earlier, they are not good at doing these financial statements. They always project it, which is quite correct. NASPER is a corporate gem of our stock exchange. But the point that I want to drive home is, if you go and read the likes of Welcome, I think it's an international company, most of the colleagues in the world knows about it, and they are collapsed, not far from NASPER. And then I would say, look at that, and there are a lot of lessons to draw from that. And similarly with the current one around Cyber, because it was equally a highly integrated company. Therefore, the rot can still be covered, but at a later stage, the company will be lost in that collapse. But I think there are interesting lessons to be learned, and to say that good luck with your studies.
Thank you. And by authority of the powers vested in me, I'll ask the final question. Sorry. Yeah, sorry.
So my question was on your methodology of focusing on the reports that were written by the media. Because my sense is that what you get in a report a day after results of a big company like Matthew shows is just interpretation of the executive summary of what was there. And given the kind of smaller companies that exist within Matthew Choice, I don't think that you've probably galvanized, for example, how those different units are making money. I don't get a sense as to how is NASPER is making money from all those ventures in online. I mean, the sense is, for example, we all know that News 24 online doesn't even break even with advertising. They don't make money. A lot of their companies are relying on the 10-cent stake to make it valuable. So it might look great in terms of technology, but if you look at Showmax and Netflix, for example, as much as Netflix is slightly more expensive, it has more uptake than Showmax in South Africa. So I'm not sure whether it's study as to where is NASPER making this money in all these online entities.
All right, I don't have to ask a question. I'll allow the panelists to respond. And you don't have to respond to all the questions. Some of them are comments as well.
I think that the questions that were asked were really kind of insightful, because they really just show the battle that we've had with the kind of and how formative this research still is. Can I begin with the last question about, how do we know what's actually going on? It's very, very difficult. The reporting is very, very opaque. And one of the things that we did find was that the majority of articles that we had culled across the four newspapers were really about share prices. And there was this obsession about Tencent, and quite rightly from a market point of view, but from a sociological point of view, not that helpful. It's really difficult as well to get any interviews with NASPERs. They are extremely resistant to putting up. I mean, they put up barriers to any kind of interaction, and basically they say refer to our annual report. And of course, the annual report is a very sanitized version of of things. But we did try to unpack quite a bit. So the answer is we really don't know too much. And I think that also, in fact, in the few minutes I've got, I want to just talk a little bit about Media 24, which is really interesting. If for no other reason, is that we don't have a wire service any longer. We don't have SAPA any longer. So we have Media 24, we have IOL, and please don't even let's go into what IOL is doing. And basically that's it. So there's a huge paucity of information there. And I think that what's really important, what we did try to emphasize, is that the heritage music media, particularly the print media, is a loss-making enterprise, or at the very best, it cuts even. And it's cross-subsidized. The tabloid newspapers keep the rest of it afloat. And it seems to cross-subsidize itself as just kind of cutting even on good days and perhaps making a little bit of a profit on bad days. So it's really interesting that that has been maintained. And I think that speaks again to the kind of emphasis on the ideological and cultural emphasis that NASCAR still clings on to, and the enormous amount of money, for instance, that went into cultural activities and the promotion of cultural activities in keeping afloat Afrikaans culture and Afrikaans values as it is emerging and changing and adapting over time. And I think that there's still a great deal more work to be done in that. Musa asked whether what's possible. Sorry, Musa, I've lost your question.
I was just asking if the reason they're holding on to their own identity is it because they're just able to stay afloat?
Yeah.
It's still comfortable. If it went on, will they abandon it?
I really couldn't answer that. I have a feeling that with the current management, they'll keep it. But what happens with the new generation of management, it's impossible to tell. And of course, the management structure itself is really interesting because it's still owned largely with still the same characters and still the same personalities that we had 15, 20 years ago, although they are kind of moving out. In that sense, what is really interesting is who owns the shares and how many of these so-called N shares are actually held by the same cabal that had held them for a very, very long time. So although there is a great deal of public relations about, for instance, selling multi-choice shares into communities and how it is uplifting, etc., the bulk of shares are held by a very small cabal. And that cabal is relatively international as well. So that we showed you that circle, about as many shares are held in South Africa as are held in the United States and in Europe. But it's very small pockets of people who hold massive amounts of shares. And that brings up the issue about the grandfathering. Much of the money that was generated, that early money that was generated through the basic monopoly of having subscription television. And you mentioned Phil Malefi, and I think Phil will, to this day, the steam comes out of his ears when we realize that, for instance, the Mnet Open Time generated almost 1/2 of their advertising revenue, and that wasn't that was on the free-to-air platform. So they were licensed as a subscription closed television platform, but in fact a great deal of their money was generated on Open Time, which was on the free-to-air platform, and that was an ongoing battle that they had an inside track to being able to manage, and I don't think that has changed at all. So the grandfathering policy, the last point about, when does the rot set in? Well, the difficulty with the model that they have is that and I think one of the reasons why they're trying to diversify, they're always looking for the next big 10 cent, because so much of their money is tied up in a single enterprise. And so for as long as that enterprise just keeps expanding, but like a helium balloon, it's fine. But so they just don't seem to be able to latch on to another major enterprise. If you take something within the South African context, as Mpumi was saying about, for instance, Takealot, The Takealot has really taken off, and they have managed in many ways to push out the oppositions. But if you look at the two biggest oppositions to them, it's Bidawai and Gumtree, they work on very different kind of business model. But I anticipate almost any day now is that we're going to see a kind of hostile takeover of at least one or other of those platforms. So that wouldn't surprise me at all. And the final thing about the kind of methodology, which we did not mention, is we chose 4 financial papers. We chose, remind me, pardon? Business Day Live, which is a Black Star TISO publication. Financial Mail, MoneyWeb, and then the last one was Fin24. And we're very aware of the kind of contradiction of using Fin24, but it's just too dominant in the market to say we're not going to take any material away from it. So that also goes to your point about the kind of sanitization of the information we get. And the difficulty of scratching under the surface. And I think that's a question, it's a bigger question about media research in general, particularly in the area of political economy. It really is very, very hard to penetrate the opaqueness of the kind of official and public relations discourse.
Let us end this session with Chinuya Achebe, because he is the one who reminds us that a man who calls his kinsmen to a feast does not do so to save them from starving. They all have food in their own homes. When we gather together in the moonlit village ground, it is not because of the moon. Every man can see it in his own compound. We come together because it is good for kinsmen to do so. And that, ladies and gents, is the spirit of the conference. Together to learn, to discuss, to interrogate, to share experiences. We can now break for lunch. Thank you.